The comic begins with a scene in a hospital, where the main character Jack is trying to pass the time by playing a video game. The guy was completely focused on the game, which he had unsuccessfully tried to complete more than once. But unfortunately, luck was not on his side that day, so he lost and is now annoyed. In a fit of anger over yet another loss, the guy threw the console away from him, not wanting to continue trying. In the silence of the empty room, Jack sat down and thought about the fact that no matter what game he played, he could never find something original and interesting. One day, on the internet, he finally found a new simple game with pixel graphics and the name Dungeon and Stone. Burning with boredom, the main character still decided to look at it, given his dislike for pixel games and games with only one English language. The game had a choice between a human, a blacksmith, a fairy, a barbarian, a furry, and one as yet unknown character. Believing that he would quickly get bored with the game, Jack chose the barbarian by chance, without even thinking about it. Still, the game was able to surprise the guy with something, showing him everything that he had not seen in games for a very long time. Maybe this caught his attention, because immediately after, the hero did not even notice how day and night flew by, and he was still playing. The game also had an interesting death mechanic, which meant that after your character was defeated, the game returned to the very beginning. Very soon he was so captivated by this game that he began to lose touch with reality, and shouted to the entire ward in front of the nurse because of another loss. The guy apologized for this, but quickly returned to the game, because other than that, he was not interested in anything. Many years passed, during which Jack left the hospital, graduated from university, and found a good job. But one thing never changed in him: his addiction to the very game that he downloaded back in the hospital, and still tried unsuccessfully to complete it. And then one dark evening, the guy sat in a chair and smiled, because luck had finally smiled on him. Jack, ready for the final battle, reached the boss room in the game he spent 9 years of his life on. Only the lights on the sides of the doors illuminated the passage in the game, as brightly as the player's confidence that the game would be completed glowed. The guy was incredibly happy about this, because his efforts had finally paid off, and he was able to reach the last test. So many hours, so many days, and so many years were spent on the game that he could not help but be proud of himself and his efforts. There were no signs of trouble. The game obediently displayed a choice window asking whether the player wanted to enter the room, to which the guy agreed immediately. But immediately, a second window appeared, warning that after entering the boss's room there would be no turning back. The guy didn't pay attention to the game's remark, and began to wait impatiently for the room to load. The loading of the last challenge began, and the player continued to wait in his thoughts about everything related to the game. The main character realized that in all these 9 years he had never reached the boss, and this would be his first and last time. He began to think through tactics against the boss, and his confidence that he could beat the boss in one go increased. A window appeared on the computer screen with the inscription that the training was completed, and everything that had happened before was just the beginning. The guy was significantly surprised by this turn of events, as he believed that this was a real game. When the game's language itself changed to Korean, the player began to realize that the game had pitfalls that were not written about anywhere, and became furious because of it. Jack began to feel irritated, realizing the fact that he spent all 9 years of his life on training, which he could have completed even faster if he had received the Korean version of the game. Suddenly, a bright blue light began to emanate from the computer, filling his entire room. Very soon, the light began to absorb Jack himself, dissolving him in the air and leaving not a trace of the guy. Eventually, it disappeared and the light returned to the computer screen, leaving the room without its owner. When the guy woke up, he noticed that he found himself among a huge number of barbarians in some dark cave. The oldest of the barbarians was their elder, who began shouting his speech to the audience. Jack was still trying to understand what place he found himself in, why this happened in the first place, and what was happening in general now. The longer he looked at the barbarians around him, the more the guy realized that he did not belong here. The main character's gaze fell on his hand, which changed after getting here. That is, it became more muscular and became covered with strange tattoos. And only then did Jack realize that his body had changed, and he had become a real barbarian among his kind, which did not bode well. The main character felt dismayed when he realized that just recently, he had only played as a barbarian, and was not one. The guy was brought out of his thoughts by the voice of the elder, who began shouting out the names of the barbarians one by one. The first barbarian confidently approached the elder, and stood on the dais, inspecting the rack of weapons that stood opposite him. The man walked up to the counter, took a double-sided axe, and raised it up, showing his choice to everyone around him. The elder continued to shout out the names of other people one by one, and each of these people began to approach him to select their weapons. The guy put all the puzzles together and realized that this meeting was an initiation ceremony for the barbarians. All the brave men who came up to choose their weapons and then raised them for display were initiated into real warriors. After the initiation of the warriors, the elder of the barbarians shouted out that the blessing of a certain Raphonia would come with them. It was at this moment that he covered his family in amazement, because it dawned on him what the main character had gotten himself into. For some reason, Jack was stuck in a game he'd been trying to beat for 9 years, with no idea how to get back. Jack was frightened when he realized the seriousness of the situation. Which, as it turned out, was not only him. He was brought out of his thoughts by the voice of the same shocked player in the body of a barbarian, who stood nearby and wondered what kind of place this was, and how he ended up here. The main character tried to find answers based on everything he knew about this game, while the second player was very nervous and biting his nails, trying to calm down. But they didn't have to think long, as suddenly the elder appeared in front of them and asked who dared to speak at the ceremony, looking at Jack first. He quickly answered in the negative, and gave the second player a disapproving look, since because of him they were noticed, and this was definitely not good. With an embittered expression on his face, the elder looked at the nervous barbarian, saying that it was he who raised the voice, and the situation continued to escalate. The red-haired man tried to get out of the situation by asking if this place was part of a game from the elder with his trembling voice. The elder considered talking with an axe to be the best answer. So without further ado and with a slight movement of his hand, he cut off the red-haired guy's head, not giving him a chance to survive. Some of the blood covered the surprised and frightened Jack, who stood close to the headless body, which only recently asked many questions and tried to find answers to them. The body fell to the ground, and the elder looked at Jack with the same stern gaze, studying him from head to toe, while the guy himself clasped his hands behind him, trying to keep all the horror inside himself so as not to die himself. The barbarian's face gave away nothing, so the elder calmed down a little and said that one of the warriors had been captured by an evil spirit, and everyone should forget about the questions that the evil spirit was asking. The elder put the axe back behind his back and began to return to the dais to continue the ceremony, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts and new information about this world. After quick information, the main character made 3 conclusions about the place in which he found himself, and now realizes even better that here the players are called evil spirits and are exterminated, so he cannot let them catch him. While the other barbarians pulled the headless body aside, the ceremony continued, and the elder began calling out the names of the other warriors to be dedicated. The hero realized that he didn't know his name here, because there was no hint of what his name was, and if they called him and he didn't fit, it would cause more suspicion, if not instant death. The main character decided that he would look around to see if anyone was coming out, and if 2 seconds passed and no one took a step, he himself could go out to the elder. Here it is, the moment when the elder shouted out the name Bjorn and began to wait for the owner of the name to emerge from the crowd of barbarians. Silence reigned in the crowd of newly minted warriors, because none of the barbarians had taken a single step closer to the elder in the past 2 seconds. Having decided to take a risk, Jack began to leave the crowd, remembering his new name, by which he would now always be called. Just like that, the hero stood in front of the elder, still tense from the whole situation, and both exchanged quick, suspicious glances. But the situation quickly defused when the elder cast aside his suspicions and, with a smile on his face, invited the warrior to choose a weapon that would accompany him on his journey. The main character approached the weapon rack and began to compare the convenience of weapons, based on his 9 years of gaming experience. Very soon, he chose his weapon and raised it up, showing the whole crowd, instead of a hammer or an axe, it was a shield, along with the adoption of which he adopted his new name. The main character's room was left empty without an owner, and only the computer screen displays information about Bjorn, and with a notification that all this information about the game character will be sent to the administrator. The main character tells us how at the very beginning of his game he tried to choose and give the barbarian 2-handed swords, a double-sided axe, and a hammer for battles. But no matter what he tried, the character died too quickly and too often, which exhausted Jack, and he began to search for alternatives that would be useful to him. Even taking into account the highest survivability among all the characters, it was impossible to achieve normal progress due to the frequent death of the barbarian. And then one day, passing by racks of weapons, the main character looked at other equipment options, namely shields. The idea came to him to try a shield, because in fact, nowhere was it written that a barbarian should take a sword or a hammer for battle, and he just needed to increase his survival time. As it turned out, the choice was not made in vain, because very soon the shield paid for itself, and Jack was able to make quite a lot of progress in the game, defeating already stronger opponents in no time. After the dedication of all the adults, Bjorn had no time left to think, as the bridge to the gate in front of them began to lower, allowing the barbarians to pass inside the city of Rathonia, where their certain goal was located. Bjorn knew exactly where they were going, so he began to get nervous, because they were going to the city center to get into the labyrinth. The bridge finally lowered, the elder blessed his clan on the road, and the entire crowd of barbarians, ready to fight against everyone, ran forward, raising clouds of dust under their feet and behind them. Bjorn also ran in the front row, trying not to be trampled by his brothers, still trying to decide what to do next, and how to proceed so that the road through Rathonia would go as smoothly as possible. They all ran after their leader, who was in front, and the main character decided to follow them, since he did not want to attract unnecessary attention, even if he did not trust how the barbarians knew the city. As it turned out, the mistrust was not in vain, because the first leader of the barbarians led them to a dead end instead of leading them to the center of the city. The crowd began to shout at the leader in discontent, while Bjorn began to understand the stupidity of the barbarian race and the seriousness of their problem. The post of temporary head was decided to be taken by a barbarian named Einar, who looked quite confident in her ability to lead the people through the streets of the city, who also very quickly accepted her. Even Bjorn took notice of her confidence and put his hopes on her that she would find her way to the city center as quickly as possible. But even she could not find the right road and failed the task, and the crowd continued to argue about who would be next. Bjorn realized that nothing good would come of this, and if nothing was done, they would not get to the city center at all, let alone within a certain time. But the guy wasn't going to risk his secret, so he approached the very depressed Einar, wanting to give her a hint about finding the way. He asked her to remain silent and quietly told the girl about his plan, giving her a chance to atone for her guilt before her relatives and lead them with her. He gave advice to follow a group of other races who know exactly how to get to the labyrinth and are also heading there. It is worth noting that here we are introduced to how races treat each other, because the whole company of strangers turned out to be arrogant and did not even intend to perceive the barbarians as equally intelligent people, openly mocking them, as if not paying attention to their open mockery. Einar quickly agreed to Bjorn's proposal with fire in her eyes, glad that she was given a second chance. The time had come to act and lead the entire horde to the center of the city. Therefore, without fear of condemnation, Einar ran up to the company to lead them again, and, to the surprise of the main character, no one was against it. They only glorified Einar, as the first time. This hole in purple space turned out to be a passage into the labyrinth, or into a world that is inhabited by a variety of monsters, which these volunteers must defeat in order to be able to get money. The closer the moment of closing the labyrinth approached, since it opens once a month for 10 minutes, Bjorn became more and more scared, since he had never fought monsters with his own hands before. He realized that even in his real world, all he did was lie in the hospital under observation for most of his life due to illnesses, and fighting with someone was out of the question. But the main character had no other choice, and not only him, but also the rest of the barbarians who had become adults, since everyone had to pay Raphonia's taxes. This mechanic was also introduced in the game, and was a mandatory part of the life of any living being who turned 20 years old in this world, and attempting to evade the tax was punishable by the guillotine. In total, in this game, there are 2 different ways to earn money to pay the tax, either a battle or the most common part-time job for people, inaccessible to barbarians, since they were always treated with disdain due to their enormous strength and stupid character. Bjorn knew that there was no other option than fighting, so he tried to convince himself to enter the labyrinth as soon as possible before the passage closed, and he had to wait a whole month before the passage reopened. Over time, the passage began to decrease. Only 5 minutes remained until the only opportunity for the barbarian to survive was closed. Bjorn tried to muster up his resolve and finally go through the portal to get into the monster's lair. The problem was that even with the body of a warrior, he could not overcome the fear of death emanating from his real brain. So even the first step was damn difficult for him. So the main character would have plunged into despair and signed his own death warrant if he had not been brought out by a woman's voice and a hand on his shoulder. It turned out to be Einar, who noticed how much Bjorn was thinking, that it even became a problem for himself. The girl noticed the guy's confusion, so she decided to come over and help him, since now the portal will close, and they will remain here for a month without means of living. Plucking up some courage, Bjorn told his friend to go ahead first, and he right behind her, to which she quickly agreed. Before entering the portal leading to the labyrinth, Einar turned around and looked at him with a confident smile on her face, saying thank you for his recent help in finding the way to the city center. This thank you and praise from anyone was the first he had ever received while in the game world. And it not only surprised him, but also added some confidence. Einar respected his wisdom and wanted to become the same, so with her hands on her hips, she asked Bjorn if there was any way to become smart, intrigued by his answer. Before exposing himself with an honest answer, he thought and said that one must learn to think before doing anything. The answer was accepted by Einar with the same radiant smile. She said that if both could survive after the labyrinth, she would definitely figure out how to repay him for his advice. Einar's words knocked the guy out of himself, since he did not expect such a decisive and calm conversation about death, and forgot that such insane determination was always inherent in real barbarians. Wanting to delve into the girl's answer, Bjorn suddenly asked with a serious expression on his face whether Einar was afraid of death. The girl did not expect such a question, and hesitated a little to answer, after which she answered with the question whether it is strange to feel fear of the inevitable. Very soon the smile returned to her face, and she explained that even though she was afraid, she had no other choice, so she was not even going to retreat. She understood perfectly well that death awaited her in any case, but she was not going to sit idly by, so she chooses to enter the labyrinth, where there is a chance to earn extra money for the monthly tax and survive. Bjorn liked this determination, even if he realized that it was only because the barbarians had no other option to earn extra money that they learned from early childhood to overcome their fear and go towards death. Filled with a sense of courage, the main character jumps into the portal at the very last moment, ready to fight monsters and survive. But if there was one thing he was not prepared for, it was the complete darkness of the first level of the labyrinth, on which there were supposed to be crystals to illuminate the cave where he found himself. Recalling the game, the main character says that usually it was not dark on the first floor because of these same crystals, so even a torch was not needed to travel through the level. But it seems that for some reason, instead of going to the beginning of the level, our barbarian was thrown into a dark zone. That is, a place on the first level where there was not a single crystal to illuminate the territory. With no one around yet, Bjorn had his hands free and tried to call up the game window, inventory, stats, menu or action window, saying their names out loud to try to make survival easier. But nothing worked, because of which the barbarian quietly went mad, realizing that the game was not of any help here at all. So he was left with only food and a shield in his hands, and if he was defeated, there would be no restart. Staying where he was not a good option due to the monsters that roamed the first level, so the guy began to move forward in search of companions and food. But after just a couple of steps, he himself did not notice how he fell into a goblin trap and cried out from pain in his right leg, falling to his knees in front of the trap. After a moment of fright, Bjorn quickly pulled himself together and covered his leg with his shield, giving himself time to calm down and pull his leg out before the local goblins gathered to hear his screams. Bjorn raised his head up in an attempt to come up with a plan of action, since he had already heard a rustling not far from him. As it turns out, goblins are the monsters of the first level of the labyrinth, which are small green and eared creatures that love to set traps for warriors, and then wait in the dark until the victim weakens and dies. This is exactly how the game works, which the main character knows, so he had to act quickly, and he began to quietly remove his wounded leg from the trap, simultaneously noticing that there was poison on the trap, which only worsened the situation. The main character stood up, holding his shield in front just in case, and began to think about the option of escaping when his right leg gave out, with which he stepped into the trap. The player's ingenuity showed itself, and Bjorn came up with a plan of action according to which he decided to move forward, as if not noticing that the goblin was somewhere nearby. Along the way, diverting attention, Bjorn, like a real barbarian, began to insult the goblin and his entire family, starting with his mother and ending with himself, reminding him that they were goblins, and not other monsters. The pain began to go away little by little due to the effect of the poison, which had a bad effect on the barbarian's condition, almost causing him to fall unconscious. But after some time of mocking the goblin, he finally appeared behind Bjorn, seemingly wanting to make Bjorn swallow his words. The sounds of footsteps echoed throughout the huge cave they were in, and the protagonist quickly looked back, ready to defend himself. But the darkness was complete. The goblin did not give any signals of presence, hiding from the barbarian's eyes and waiting for the right moment to attack. Then the guy tried to run away from the monster, accelerating with all his strength and as much as his wounded and numb leg allowed. But as soon as the player stopped, the goblin did the same, and when he had to run, the goblin followed him, not allowing the distance to either increase or decrease. Bjorn began to get tired and realized that this was not a chase, but rather a game of cat and mouse, where the guy was the very mouse that began to get tired. But the goblin was only happy about this, wanting to continue the game and watch how the victim falls from exhaustion, is exhausted and dies in fear, and it stands nearby smiling. Bjorn abandoned the path towards the goblin and turned around, making an attempt to leave now, because he had neither the strength nor the opportunity to fight. But the wounded warrior did not pass for long, after which he fell to the ground like a stone, trying to imitate the dead, which was his plan. The goblin became interested in this turn of events and continued to watch the barbarian's corpse with intrigue, feeling some kind of catch in this whole situation. To test his thought, he threw a stone at the head of the still-living Bjorn, which slightly infuriated the second while he tried to pretend to be dead. But the plan was successful, and Bjorn was able to deceive the goblin, and he began to quietly approach Bjorn's body, intending to rob the player. Before the goblin could touch his shoulder, the guy quickly turned around and caught the goblin by surprise. Sparing no effort, Bjorn struck at the goblin, who managed to jump away from their affected area, away from the barbarian. But before losing hope completely, the body was taken control and struck a second time. This time, everything went well, and the guy grabbed the goblin by the throat, throwing him into the nearest wall and continuing to beat him for some time, using all the strength given to him. And here it is, the final blow, for which the guy folded his hands crosswise and hit the goblin's head with all his might. So, with some tension, he was able to finish off the annoying goblin, and he could have been left lying completely beaten, if not for one moment. The goblin's body began to disappear into clouds of sparkles and light as Bjorn leaned closer to see if there was anything left of it. Instead of a body, a small, lonely scarlet crystal was left on the ground, which is another type of currency in the city of Raphonia. The guy picked up the stone and sighed heavily because he had spent so much time and so much effort on just one stone. Bjorn put his hand on the wall, leaning on it, and got back to his feet, because it was time to continue on his way. In this world, there are many different types of monsters that inhabit the world of the labyrinth. The next one is stronger than the previous one, and each of them disappears after death, leaving behind some things and scarlet crystals. And outside the labyrinth is the large and rich city of Rathonia, in which all races live together and in safety. But even if this is all the world of the game, he will never again be able to perceive his reality only as a game. A lot of time passed, and Bjorn was still trying to find a way out of the dark zone, this time by crawling on the ground, which was a plus since he did not have to use his injured leg anymore. But in the same way, only thanks to small steps, the guy was able to dodge the traps, immediately noticing them. The main character felt damn tired. Sweat began to fall from his forehead, but he continued to crawl in the hope of finding help. The road was long. He was losing more and more blood. He did not meet anyone on the way, and the barbarian had no hope left. When everything started to double in the eyes, even the almost dead main character was just a stone's throw away from the exit. This gave Bjorn strength, and he continued to crawl towards the source of light in the hope of finding someone who would help him heal his leg before his death. But these same thoughts are opposed by his realistic alter ego, or one of his personalities that was aware of the whole burden of life as a barbarian, who was not exactly loved. It tries to convince the main character to give up, since he is not an intelligent man and not a beautiful girl to be saved, and therefore he cannot expect help from people in such a situation. But Bjorn is not going to lose heart when the exit is so close to him and continues to creep forward, despite the severity of his well-being. In the end, luck was on his side, and he met his first group of adventurers, or rather people of different races who were exploring the world of the labyrinth just like himself. One of the adventurers drew attention to the barbarian who was dying and reported what he saw to the leader. The head of the squad squatted down next to Bjorn, thinking that it was suspicious that the newcomer, also a barbarian, had reached this place before the experts, who were visiting the labyrinth not for the first time. But this arrangement is only to his advantage, since it is possible to obtain information from a newcomer who is about to die without their help. The blonde turns his head towards the team and asks their priestess if she can help heal the traveler, while the main character himself was notably surprised at their luck that a priestess capable of healing had penetrated between them. But even taking into account the terrible state of the hero, who has only 2 life points out of 100 left, the priestess Ursina with a calm face answers in the negative, not intending to help Bjorn, which the goblin's victim was also surprised by. But this does not greatly confuse the head of the squad, and he turns to another member of the team, Patsrin, to borrow 1 restoration potion, even if it is for special cases where the priestess's magic cannot help. In order for the potion to work, The main character had to pour it on the very leg that was in the trap. And when he touched the wound, the potion began to emit something like steam. Even though Bjorn's health began to rapidly recover, the feeling was, to put it mildly, not the best, which is why the barbarian screamed in agony, unable to cope with so much acute pain. Soon the pain passed, and along with it all the poison that the guy was poisoned with because of the same trap evaporated. The leg became ready for use again, so the guy began to get up little by little, still trying to calm down after feeling such a close death. No longer because of the poison, but because of the sensations that the potion gave. Taking advantage of the quid pro quo rule, the blonde tried to buy information from the main character about how he, seemingly a novice, got into the dark zone before them. Bjorn was not surprised by this turn of events, and even a little glad, since disinterested help would be even more suspicious than help with benefits. But still, he replied that he knew nothing and had appeared there from the very beginning. As it turned out, this is popularly called spatial instability, due to which only once every few hundred years can you immediately enter the dark zone. Bjorn was surprised, since they were so experienced that they were able to take even a magician and a priestess into the team. But on the very first journey, Bjorn encountered something that they had never encountered. Be that as it may, their company did its job and hurried away, and the blonde thanked the barbarian for such an interesting story, and said that he needn't worry about the price of the potion, and that he was free. Although he should be glad that he survived, the situation left some wound on Bjorn's soul, since he did not like how they simply took pity on him, even wasting their time in the labyrinth, which was as valuable as gold. While the barbarian was recovering, a company of adventurers decided to follow the guy's bloody trail and see where it would lead. And during the journey, they talked about how lucky the newcomer was, because he met them, and what luck it was that it was the blonde Drows who spoke to him, and not Patsrin, who did not even want to give the restoration potion, justifying that there were clouds of people like Bjorn in this world. Along the way, bringing up this topic, Patsran asked the priestess Ursin if he was right about this, to which she simply silently looked away, not wanting to answer this question. Another girl began to defend her friend, simultaneously throwing in the fact that there is a clause in the rules of the temple that does not allow treating just anyone, and if not for this clause, Ursin would have cured the barbarian in a matter of seconds. She did not forget to tell Patsran that it was better to follow the example of Drows and embellish her intentions, since not a single barbarian could tolerate the fact that someone else was helping him. This offended the warriors. Drows himself was not averse to noticing how the girl began to defend the barbarian, which seemed funny to him. But the conversation quickly turned into a different direction when Drows asked when the trail of blood left by the wounded protagonist would end. We learn that the blonde is quite familiar with the map of the first floor of the labyrinth, therefore he is their guide in the darkness, which, according to Ursin, greatly facilitates the exploration of the floors. Their destination was a large room with a strange stone table in the middle, and Drows noted that it seemed that they were the first to find this place, so they had to hurry. A light touch to the stone board was enough to open a huge white door, the light of which quickly illuminated the entire room where they were. This door turned out to be a portal, which, as the blonde himself says, should lead them to the second floor of the labyrinth. But before entering, a girl with brown hair looked to the side and called out to the guys, drawing their attention to one of the corners of the room, as she saw something quite interesting. It turned out to be a goblin's trap, and next to it lay the bloody slipper of the barbarian Bjorn, which meant that he had already been here or had appeared. The magician agreed with the girl, and raised his hand up to create and use light in order to illuminate the path and notice whether the same bloody tracks lead here. A beam of light obediently flew along the trail and, as it turned out, they led to this very trap, and this is where they began. The company was quite surprised and tried to put the puzzles together in an attempt to understand how he could crawl for so long with a wounded leg. The situation was aggravated by the answer of Drows, who calculated that if you crawl in the footsteps of the barbarian and without shortcuts, it would be 15 kilometers, which surprised the magician even more. While the magician kept trying to understand how Bjorn turned out to be not only so tenacious, but also brave enough to crawl into the darkness, Patsrin was inclined to believe that the barbarian turned out to be a psycho, because not everyone can crawl into the unknown pitch darkness. Little by little, putting the whole picture together, the guy remembered that the wounded man was stretching forward his right hand where his only crystal lay, which, to Patsrin's great surprise, he not only did not forget about, but also tried to give as payment for help. This made the guy think and take back his words about the fact that there are a lot of people like this barbarian. But Bjorn was something more. He was a psychopath who could not be killed or broken so easily, because the warrior would fight to the end. After his near-death experience, Bjorn continued to encounter goblins in the cave, continuing to fight them and honing his skills, as it was much easier to do in the light. The traps were placed randomly on the ground, but now that they were visible, they were not a source of harm. This time, even if the goblin attacks the barbarian from behind, he will be able to fight back, since the attacks have become predictable and cover is obvious. There was only one problem left, which was the hunger and thirst of the main character, because he had not eaten since the very beginning of his stay on the first floor of the labyrinth. Bjorn remembered that the head gave him some food with him and began to take out a bag of food. But as it turned out, crawling was not the best idea, since the bag was torn and most of it was lost, so he would have to eat at a minimum. The game already had such a mechanic, then hunger appeared only in the labyrinth and you didn't have to carry water with you since there was no thirst mechanic. But this is no longer a game and he has no one to expect help from. So there is nothing left to do but come to terms with the harshness of reality and try to find at least some source of water. While searching for water, he finally found a source, and next to him was another adventurer, or more simply, a person. Even though this was their first meeting, they avoided each other, as if there was an unspoken rule that stated that one should not contact or talk with other travelers without a good reason. When the man left, the barbarian decided to stay and count his crystals that he had been able to earn up to that point, and their number was 43. But the problems didn't end there either, as all these battles with the goblins had left him extremely tired. So he decided to walk around and try his luck in finding a night ally, a companion who would watch over you while you slept, since God was not the best option. But his life, it seems, did not even know about such a word as luck, because his bloody body, tall stature and low timbre of his voice continually frightened all the travelers, and they tried to get their feet as quickly as possible and away from him. But maybe such a quick selection was for the best. Since this is the labyrinth, you cannot be sure that your ally, whom you found, will not kill you in your dream. And Bjorn was just like the one who would definitely kills all-night allies to collect resources. So he was left alone, because everyone refused him for various reasons, even if their source was still the barbarian. The guy was about to give up if a guy from behind hadn't called out to him, offering his candidacy for the role of a night ally. Bjorn was very surprised because for the first time a person himself approached him to become night allies. In the game it was called a night companion and was only a plus. But in real life Bjorn could not completely trust the guy who had just extended his hand for a handshake and said his name, Hans. The man's handshake turned out to be a little unconventional, and while Hans seemed to be trying to provoke Bjorn to sin based on his manner of speaking, he kept an angry and serious expression on his face, not intending to cooperate in this matter. It all ended with a handshake, but both asked a good question about who would sleep first and decided to play rock, paper, scissors in order to decide who would be first. The game ended in the first round with Hans winning, which meant that he would sleep for the first 2 hours. Hans lent the protagonist his pocket watch and pointed his finger at the time at which the barbarian should wake him up, still thinking that he was stupid enough to use it. Bjorn was a little puzzled by how barbarians were underestimated here, looking at the representatives of this race as very stupid destroyers. But perhaps this could be to his advantage if used correctly. Nighttime came, and Hans was the first to go to bed, who fell asleep immediately, without hesitating for a second, which intrigued Bjorn, and he continued to guard his companion, even though there was no danger yet. 2 hours passed, and the barbarian began to wake up his still sleepy friend, so that he could now lie down to rest, even if this idea frightened him. Bjorn began to go to bed and began to snore, not really trying to sleep, in order to make sure that death during sleep was not destined for him, and Hans did not notice the setup from the barbarian. And even considering that the barbarian was open, the man did not take a single step, and as a result, after 2 hours they changed places, and Bjorn sat on a stone, feeling depressed and sleepy. Since all this time he did not take his eyes off Hans, but he couldn't trust the stranger he'd just met any other way, and he himself came up and offered to stay together for the night. And even now Bjorn doesn't trust the guy, which makes him think that he's more likely to die from exhaustion. Very soon, his eyes also began to droop from the fatigue that had accumulated over all the time he had been surviving, fighting and looking for a companion for the night, and his eyelids finally closed. But he had to wake up very soon, and not from something calm, but from the scream of Hans, who stood and smiled as if nothing had happened. Nothing really happened while he was sleeping. So Hans said that everything was fine and forgave the barbarian's sleepiness, not intending to scold him. This was unexpected for Bjorn, and he thinks about the man's words very seriously. while he asks for an apology and says that he can keep watch again. But Hans is completely against it and himself allows the main character to go to sleep, which seemed very strange to the second one. And it seems, this time, he will also have a hard time. The character fell asleep, thinking about everything that Hans had done because he seemed friendly, judging by the way he himself approached. When the barbarian had a difficult situation, he was not angry when his companion also fell asleep, and in the end, he also refused compensation for a mistake. But there are no good people in the game that Bjorn knows, and the sudden click that wakes him up confirms this. Hans sat above the barbarian's head with a maniacal smile, asking if he had already woken up. And the next moment, he offered another option for the main character to sleep longer. That is, to get hit on the head with a hammer and die. This situation does not suit him, and the guy sharply dodges the blow, rising to his knees and moving away from the hammer. Hans was also surprised at how Bjorn dodged the blow in time. And this only made the liar understand that he would not live long, because the barbarian realized everything. Just the sight of such an enraged warrior already said that the owner of the hammer should no longer hope for mercy, and pure rage was visible in his eyes. Hans tried to soften the situation, still believing that the barbarians were stupid enough to believe his lies. But no one was going to listen to him, and Bjorn ran at him with his shield at full speed. One blow to the jaw was still not enough to close Hans's mouth, and he again tried to ransom his life, saying that he would tell everything if the barbarian spared him. So the barbarian hit him with his shield twice, throwing his body into the cave wall with incredible volume. Before delivering the final blow, Bjorn decided to ask why Hans wanted to kill him in the first place. Now we can talk, as Hans thought and said that he wanted to steal the shield and crystals that Bjorn received. But there was something else about which he wanted to remain silent like a fish. The main character sensed something was wrong and kicked the man in the jaw, after which he stood him on his chest and asked again what he wanted to take from the barbarian after he killed him. As it turned out, it was the heart of a barbarian, which in this world was worth its weight in gold for alchemy and brewing potions, where it is one of the components for creating very powerful potions. Hans tried to ask for forgiveness for the attempted murder, and tried to assure the barbarian that if the barbarian let him live, he would not regret it, as if he believed that he still had a chance to remain whole. But his decision sealed his fate, and Bjorn completely agreed. So he raised his shield over the guy and hit with all his might, killing the man for the first and last time, which increased the strength of his psyche. Even though the meeting with Hans ended rather badly, the guy couldn't help but note that it was still useful, since he was able to find a lot of necessary things that were now left without an owner. Among the things, he was able to find many necessary things that not only simplified the exploration of the floor, but also actually gave him a chance to stop being a savage, because water was finally at hand, just like a watch for measuring time and a compass for orientation in space. He found irony in this. As soon as after the first murder he became richer and was able to begin to live like a real civilized person, and not a savage, which they so loved to call barbarians. The hammer, which he also took with him, was urgently tested on the goblins that continued to come at him from different angles. One swing of the new weapon was enough to kill them. While reflecting on how he still felt like he was in someone else's body, he also remembered that it was the second day, and that's why the goblins started appearing in pairs instead of alone. Even if that fact didn't change anything, he still simply dealt with the goblins, thanks to the power of the hammer and other things that increased his combat power. And now the progress has become much greater and faster, which could not but rejoice. But the problem appeared again, because of the incident with Hans, the guy could not sleep, and exhaustion only became greater every time he fought off the goblins. But he had no other choice but to sleep alone and leave his life to the will of the gods, so he leaned his back against the wall and crossed his arms over his chest, intending to sleep. But no one said that sleep freed him from the goblins who tried to come closer as soon as our protagonist closed his eyes. The evil Bjorn swung his hammer at them and shouted in rage about how they tortured him, which made even the goblins feel scared. The fairly tired guy again stood opposite the cave wall and closed his eyes, hoping that he had killed everyone, and now he could sleep peacefully. But the goblins decided everything for him when he felt a sharp pain in his chest, and noticed a goblin who suddenly attacked the sleeping man and stuck his small stake into his chest. This infuriated the guy, and he hit the goblin in the face with all his might, so much so that he flew past his brother and was just thinking of attacking Bjorn. Bjorn didn't want to tolerate this anymore, and he didn't intend to, when he again looked like a killing machine and invited the goblin to come up and be the next one he kills for disturbing his sleep. But one warning in the form of a dead friend was enough for him, and the goblin began to scream, running away as fast as he could, while the barbarian looked after him, not even intending to catch up with the green one. The longer the main character did not sleep, the more he realized that he needed sleep. Otherwise, he would be defeated because of something that he could not help but notice in his normal state. So immediately after treating the wound, the barbarian decided to go in search of another companion for the night. But for himself, the guy decided that another barbarian would be the best companion, and he immediately rejected the candidacy of people who themselves began to find him and offered to spend the night together, even if they suddenly became visible at every step. But even here his luck did not help, since according to another adventurer, most of the barbarians were already on the higher floors, and there were definitely no more than 100 on this one, which made the barbarian think again. He couldn't risk another night without sleep. So he decided to radically change his plan and take on someone who is not human as a companion. After another hour of wandering around the first floor, he finally found someone, namely a lonely fairy, who could become his ally. The fairy also noticed him, but it seemed that she was not as happy to meet him as he was and immediately tensed up, expecting something worse, for example, a fight. When asked by Bjorn whether she was alone, instead of answering, the fairy remained silent, took her bow and arrows, not trusting the stranger, and was ready to fight back. But Bjorn doesn't mind, because he understands that every wounded person would be afraid of a barbarian who came from nowhere. A little later, during the silence, the main character noticed that the fairy was wounded in the side, and, apparently, the wound was not inflicted by a goblin knife. Bjorn immediately noticed and asked if she had received this wound from a person, while trying to take a closer look at the girl and noticing that the fairy's sleep situation was even worse than his, but she was not going to answer the question either. Suddenly, the girl fell to her knees and clasped her hands together, praying with tears in her eyes for the barbarian to help her, understand her, and let her go. Bjorn, who still considered fairies to be cold creatures, was greatly surprised when he heard her plea and tears, things completely unexpected for him. She still hoped to evoke at least a drop of compassion in him and thus get out of the situation alive. So she mentioned that she had a little brother at home who would definitely not survive on his own. Bjorn realized that his idea of fairies turned out to be false, although in the game all the fairies were really cold and had the same strong character. Realizing his mistake, he sat down next to her to correct the misunderstanding and smiled to reassure her, and it even seemed to work. But no matter how sweet the words were, his facial expression quickly spoiled everything, making himself look like some kind of maniac who, before killing, would still play enough with his victim, which only frightened the girl more. The smile on the maniac's face did not help one bit, so the girl only began to cry harder and look for a way out of the situation, becoming more and more nervous, and during the conversation she even mentioned that he was a barbarian, and this may mean that the real reason was race. This pissed off the main character even more and forced him to ask himself every now and then what kind of reputation they have that some consider ordinary people, while others are scared to death, even if they behave calmly and don't hit. Be that as it may, the situation needed to be saved. So Bjorn decided to act and gave her bandages and leaves of the licho plant so that she could treat the wound, and stood aside, waiting for the moment when she would finish and they could talk normally. Once the fairy had finished treating the wound and using bandages, she became more willing to talk, feeling a little calmer when she received some healing herbs for the wound instead of being bullied. Bjorn sat down opposite the fairy and asked her name, at the same time giving his own. The fairy finally introduced herself as Erwin, still feeling awkward. Immediately after meeting, Bjorn decided to ask the girl why she was so afraid of the fact that he was a barbarian, and the fairy replied that the reason was the long-standing enmity between fairies and barbarians, which had been sharpening between the races for a very long time. At the same time, Erwin quickly adds that he does not hold a grudge against the barbarians, since the war ended 10 years ago, and he does not want to fight with the main character in any case, just like him, because he wants to become companions for the night. She didn't have to wait long, and Bjorn was the first to offer her to become companions for the night so that both could benefit and sleep, since the fatigue of both parties was obvious, which she decided to think about. Erwin remembered that the barbarians valued military dignity above all else, so the fairy asked her to swear on military honor that Bjorn would not do anything while sleeping, and the girl would swear in the same way, but in the name of her clan. The deal was accepted, and both simultaneously swore that they would not touch their sleeping companion during the duration of the oath. That is, at night. Bjorn was the first to volunteer to sleep, presenting Erwin with a fait accompli, so he began to lay out the blanket and pillow on the ground, giving the fairy his pocket watch and telling her to wake him up in 2 hours. There was nothing to do, and the girl agreed to guard her companion, until he suddenly realized that after meeting Hans, who almost killed the main character, it would be much more difficult to sleep. So he decided to close his eyes and watch her. But not even 5 seconds had passed before he was awakened by Erwin's sudden cry. As it turned out, 2 hours had already passed, and he didn't even notice how he lay down and quickly fell asleep, which is why the barbarian considered it lucky that he didn't ask Hans for a blanket with a pillow. Otherwise, he would no longer be alive. It was the fairy's turn to sleep, so he gave her a blanket and a pillow so that she could have a good rest after her hard day. At first, she was against it, but it seems the power of the warmth and softness of the blanket made her very quickly change her mind and accept the sleeping conditions. The blanket was so magical that it awakened in her an unprecedented real fatigue that Erwin immediately fell to the ground and wrapped herself in the blanket, while Bjorn sat down on a stone ledge nearby and observed the surroundings. The only interlocutor had been sleeping deeply for a long time, and thoughts began to return to the real world. Questions arose about what was happening there, whether they were looking for him, whether there was at least someone to whom Bjorn was important and who noticed the guy's disappearance. But very quickly, Bjorn reduced all questions to nothing and closed his eyes, knowing full well that in that world no one was waiting for him, and such thoughts would only make his psyche break down and give up, which the main character definitely did not want. Almost 2 hours have passed, and in 10 minutes they will need to continue their journey through the caves alone, right? The barbarian looked at the sleeping Erwin, thinking about his next move, because if he wants to find an accomplice here, she could be his last chance. Erwin is an excellent archer and the best ally, because you can take a nap with her and stay alive. You can trust her. More goblins began to appear, which made the choice obvious. But at the same time, if he agrees, his share of crystals will decrease, and he himself can easily cope with 3 or 4 goblins. So he had to continue to puzzle over this issue. Thoughts were interrupted by the steps of 2 men, who, as soon as they noticed the main character and the girl, turned towards them. The 2 immediately seemed suspicious and seemed to be looking for Erwin, as they began whispering about her, obviously happy about this discovery. One of the adventurers approached the barbarian and began to question him about who he was to the fairy, to which he answered honestly, a companion for the night. But instead of answering the next question about how long their union would last, Bjorn frightened them with his menacing appearance and asked them to leave from here. This gave the desired effect and scared the guys who were actually looking for the fairy for their own purposes. The strangers quickly gave up and were not going to anger the barbarian, so they grinned evilly and hurried away, which seemed even more suspicious to Bjorn, because they didn't just come here anyway. There was clearly a catch somewhere, so Bjorn hurried to wake up the girl while there was time. But she refused to wake up, only turned away and continued to sleep, not wanting to part with the warm blanket. Soon, the main character realized that she was only pretending to be asleep, so there was nothing else to do but take her by the shoulders and lift her so that the girl could not sneak away. And he asked why the fairy was pretending to be asleep. Erwin nevertheless shared that she did not really want to part with the barbarian, since he was kind and helped her feel safe. So she continued to sleep in order to prolong their stay together. Pondering over her words and the facts he left the moment of allyship unanswered and simply began to compose himself, telling her to do the same. Instead, Bjorn asked Erwin what happened to her with those guys, since those 2 know about the girl. To which the fairy at first answered nothing, but then thought longer. The girl suggested that these 2 could be from the same clan as the man who shot her, because they had the same emblem belonging to the Crystal Union, which owns the 1st floor. Information about the group could have been the deciding factor in choosing between cooperation and loneliness, if Bjorn had not looked at Erwin and noticed how nervous she was, and did not have much chance of surviving. Then the barbarian decided to keep the fairy near him if she told her what happened between her and that clan, and the fact that Erwin would not be left alone pleased her very much, and her smile shone again. On the way, Erwin explained that she was unlucky to meet the director of the clan and become his night companion, since the guy tried to use and kill the fairy in her sleep, and it was a miracle how she was able to escape, even though she was injured during the escape. Bjorn was surprised by the fact that they still continued to pursue her, even though she had fled to another part of the dungeon without a tail. To this, Erwin said that in their arsenal there are local prototypes of walkie-talkies, which are called stone transmitters with a range of 300 meters, and allow talking at a distance only if they are previously synchronized with each other. Leaving the girl alone was as bad an idea as staying in one place for a long time, so they pressed the issue, and the main character asked why she was being pursued, to which Erwin replied that she allegedly accidentally cut off one of the clan director's sensitive spots with a knife. This surprised Bjorn so much that he called the fact of the chase not a mockery, but karma in its purest form, even if he didn't say it out loud. But in some century, the fairy's answer removed all questions about the chase. Since she felt calmer next to someone, Erwin admitted that the situation with the knife only amused the girl, and with a laugh on her face talked about rumors that no potions helped the director to reattach it. They continued to escape, when suddenly the girl noticed and told her companion that someone was chasing them. So the best option would be not to turn around, but to run further and come up with a plan as they went. Erwin told him the distance, namely 150 meters, and the hero noticed that at such a distance he could not hear anything, but the girl did not lie. So the barbarian is inclined to the hypothesis that this is another superpower of fairies that distinguishes the species from other races. They decided not to waste time and speed up in an attempt to break away and hide from their pursuers. But the distance remained exactly the same, which could mean that their movements had already been reported to the others. Since this is the situation, it would have been possible to destroy them on his own, if the clan had not been focused specifically on the barbarian's companion, which added risks. So he tried to ask Erwin about what combat aspects she was good at. In addition to her archery accuracy and excellent hearing, his companion was capable of using spirits, namely the element of fire, which was a rather rare addition among fairies. Bjorn was glad to hear such an answer, and asked if she had killed in the past, to which she replied that she had not done such a thing before but was still capable of such a thing, which increased the chances of survival. While escaping from his pursuers, the main character offered to officially become allies, which only pleased Erwin more, and she agreed without hesitation, even though she was entitled to only 10% of all the crystals received here. They continued to run as fast as they could, but the distance began to close, so they decided to improvise and hide in the darkness of the cave, waiting for the best moment to attack. With a quick wave of her hand, Erwin summoned the spirit of fire, and they went deeper into the cave, which, as Bjorn noticed, he'd already been to, and did not think that he would have to return. The girl canceled the call and the fire disappeared, leaving them hidden in the darkness. But even so, their pursuer followed them and stopped nearby, as if trying to pick up a scent. There was no time to reason, and Bjorn quickly ordered Erwin to shoot to kill, otherwise they would be found out. The arrow was fired immediately and hit the pursuer in the head, causing his body to fall lifeless to the ground. Bjorn praised the fairy's accuracy and courage, because if she had faltered, they were in great danger, and he approached the corpse, trying to examine it and find something interesting, and found that same stone transmitter. The main character took the transmitter and began to listen to what the evil director was saying, who had just realized that his ally was dead, and ordered everyone listening to this transmission to gather in the goblin area to capture the barbarian and the fairy. The guy decided to see if the dead man had anything interesting, but there was nothing unusual. Only 2 knives, a bag of stones, and 1 potion to restore health. But there was a plus for the girl, who was able to take his clothes and use them on herself, since it was already leather armor, and, as the barbarian noticed, the fairy's aura also changed for the better after changing clothes. After they figured out how to turn on the stone transmitter, they listened to another message from the director, who already knew where they were, so he ordered everyone to look and put a reward of 10,000 zlotys. This turn only scared Erwin, since now no one could be trusted, and Bjorn assured her that everything would be fine if they started walking through the darkness with the spirit of fire, and then got to the passage to the 2nd floor. The girl turned out to be a little scared by the plan with the 2nd floor, since the 1st and 2nd floors are radically different from each other, and Erwin had never been there before, as well as Bjorn himself, who reassured her and said that they made an excellent team, so there's nothing here not scary. But the idea still did not inspire confidence in her, since it was similar to them going into the orc's lair to escape from the goblins. But the increase in the ante from the director in her search quickly convinced the girl, who wanted to remain alive and untouched. Before continuing on her way, Erwin stopped Bjorn and pointed out a new trap, which he had not seen for a long time, which indicated that goblins were rare in the darkness, and this made the barbarian even more doubt his luck when he remembered how at the very beginning he took 2 steps and fell into a trap. The pretty fairy, still trying to repay the main character for his kindness, took on the role of dealing with this trap and ran up to him, while Bjorn instructed the girl not to use the power of the spirit, since they would soon need her powers. Voluntarily and forcibly, Erwin agreed and was about to remove the trap when 2 goblins jumped on top of her, ready to kill her on the spot. But the girl was not taken aback and shot both of them, after which she expected praise from her companion, standing among the bodies of the same creatures, which began to turn into glowing dust. Bjorn really praised her, calling her an excellent archer and looking at her happy face, noting to himself that Erwin turned out to be much more agile and stronger than he expected. But this was even for the better. Erwin gave her companion both crystals and with a smile reminded them of their agreement, which states that out of 10 stones, she is entitled to 1, so she said that she would work harder, since she promised her younger brother to buy something. Bjorn quietly agreed that they needed to fight more to get more crystals, and he wondered if she was trying to sue him by repeating the terms of the agreement again in this context. As time passed, they continued to move through the darkness, and the reward for capturing the fairy doubled. This time, the conditions were much simpler, either alive or dead, which only worsened Erwin's mood, as she continued to become even more nervous. As they later noticed, everything was going too smoothly, since there was no unity in the Crystal Union and there were no those who wanted to go in search of them. But when the Barbarian thought about it, the fairy had already noticed the catch. The Barbarian had a lot of luck, as they came across enemies that looked like zombies and were stronger than goblins, called ghouls, and should be in the south, not in the north, where the only portal is located, and towards which they are going. In the game that Bjorn knows, there was a strange mechanic with experience that is needed to improve the character's characteristics, and is dropped only when the player kills a representative of another type of monster for the first time, and upon repeated killing, experience is not awarded. Therefore, the Barbarian quickly realized and suggested that they fight together against the ghouls, with Erwin taking on the distant monsters, and the Barbarian taking on those who are closer. The ghouls had a peculiarity due to which they began to attack the adventurers only when they entered a certain zone, closer to the monsters, which the guy did. And one step was enough for the monsters, and they attacked the main character in a crowd. These monsters were faster and stronger than the goblins, but they were still rank 9 creatures, which meant that they were still weak. The attacks were just as simple and predictable, so Bjorn did not pay attention to the fact that the ghoul was trying to attack from behind. But soon, the ghoul was shot by Erwin, which prompted the main character to think that he had correctly decided to team up with her and not separate after the night, as was originally planned. The battle did not last long, so they collected the crystals and continued their journey north. When suddenly the 3rd day ended, and Erwina noticed a trail of blood leading north, which excited the Barbarian because it could be his trail. As it turned out, this trail of blood and crumbs of bread was indeed his, as it led into the same trap next to which his slipper lay, and deeper in the room shone a portal that would lead all adventurers to the next floor. This incredibly enraged the Barbarian, and he hit the ground with his hammer with all his might and screamed, scaring the girl, since the hero went through so much pain, so many goblins, and the portal was behind him all this time. Erwin put the puzzles together and tried to guess what the main character went through and why he was so enraged, but the attempt was unsuccessful, and she decided that the Barbarian had lost a comrade, and the girl assured that the dead companion had definitely gone to heaven. The Barbarian imagined that he did not hear this, since the only partner who died was Hans, and asked the fairy if she was ready to follow him to the 2nd floor, to which she nodded positively and smiled. Staying in one place even on the 1st floor was pointless and also dangerous, so without further ado, they ran and jumped into the portal leading to the 2nd floor of the labyrinth, into the Goblin Forest. The portal literally spat them out in the air, so the landing was not successful for Bjorn, and he simply fell to the ground, without even having time to group himself, as Erwin did. The main character sat down and looked around, simultaneously trying to understand whether there was danger somewhere nearby, while the fairy looked around in amazement, since the floor was a forest, grass underfoot, and a clear sky strewn with stars, which could not be seen on the 1st floor. Erwin notes that she has never heard that there is a forest on this floor, to which she was told about one of the zones on the 2nd floor, since here they differ greatly from each other, and you can get to each zone through the portals on the 1st floor, located in the north, west, east, and south. And, to the north of the 2nd floor, where they are located, there is also a goblin forest, which is teeming with goblins themselves and their varieties, which are even more agile than when they were in the caves. To the east is an area called the Beast's Lair, where all sorts of beast-like monsters live, which only look like beasts, but are even more powerful. The same ghouls live in the west, and their territory is called the Dead Zone, the name of which also speaks for itself, because that place is full of restless souls who want to taste the adventurers. And finally, if someone wanted to try out their sword or hammer for crushing stones, the Stone Mountain Zone in the south is perfect for them, where each stone is a formidable opponent, capable of overwhelming you with the stones of which they are made. Bjorn rose to his feet and asked Erwin if she knew how they would return to the city from the labyrinth. To which she nodded and replied that after a certain time, the labyrinth itself begins to throw people out. And this was the correct answer, and the time after which the labyrinth throws adventurers out of itself was different for each floor. So you could only stay on the first floor for 168 hours, and on the second this time was already 240. Their plan was to spend these 168 hours on the second floor and wander not far from the portal itself, since the Crystal Union could not get here due to their inability to work as a team, and the main characters would go on a little reconnaissance. This forest was quite quiet, and Bjorn was in no hurry to talk. So Erwin took the initiative, simultaneously talking about how the forest resembles the forest of fairies, the girl's home, even though she realizes that this feeling is just nostalgia, and that the forest is the place is full of goblins. And not 2 minutes had passed before the guys stumbled upon the first trap, hidden in the leaves of the tree, under which it lay and where the fairy pointed. The barbarian did not notice anything, but the girl's keen eye was already trained to notice such simple traps, so she picked up a stone from the ground and was about to throw it into the foliage. Erwin's words turned out to be true, and with a slight movement of her hand, she threw a stone into the trap, activating it. Proud of herself, she asked her companion how he liked her accuracy and visual acuity, wanting to hear one more praise. She deserved it, and he understood that he could rely on her, but his mouth gave a completely different answer, namely the question of how she throws stones so poorly, not wanting to praise the girl. It would be a lie to say that she was not puzzled by such an answer from her ally, and was notably upset, even after he appointed her responsible for searching for and destroying traps. But a little later, he tried to reassure his companion and said that she shouldn't worry about such a trifle, because he considers her friend an experienced adventurer, and her mood immediately rose back. Satisfied, Erwin tried to hide how glad she was to hear such words from his lips, and simply closed her eyes, grinning, while Bjorn quickly noticed that the fairy was still naive and easy to manipulate. They didn't have to stand still for a long time, and they moved on until Erwin noticed that even though there were goblin traps, and they were in the goblin forest, she couldn't smell a single monster in the circle, as if they weren't there. This turned out to be quite strange for Bjorn, who realized that later they might still have problems in the form of entire groups of goblins, 10 in each, and archers and swordsmen might be among the monsters. Also, the further into the forest, the more goblins with a higher level there will be, which could also aggravate the situation for newcomers. But this information was of no use now, since they decided to stay near the portal and clear the place from traps. The destruction of the traps went smoothly thanks to Erwin, who saw each of them and tried to curry favor with her companion, so that she would be praised once again for her efforts. And he danced to her tune and still praised her, calling her an experienced adventurer. The sweet moment did not last long, and the girl spotted the movement of a whole group of 10 goblins, including warriors and archers, at a distance of 50 men, but they had not yet noticed the adventurers. Soon the two found the entire group of goblins, and the fairy quietly crept closer to the pack to begin to act on the plan they had agreed upon among themselves. Erwin should have made the first move, shooting in their direction and trying to shoot at least one of the goblins. But Bjorn did not hear anything, and did not understand whether the arrow hit the target. The barbarian immediately rushed forward, about to begin the battle, motioning for the fairy to stay behind him, to which she agreed. The girl ran away looking back all the time while the guy was already facing goblins in battle, smashing everyone with both his hammer and shield. Among these goblins, who were already stronger than the previous ones, there could also be mutants, the fact of whose existence should have frightened Bjorn. But the warrior's heart, which he received during rebirth, only began to tremble with the happiness of a new battle. This only played into his hands, and he entered the battle, sparing neither himself nor his strength, killing the goblins one by one with both shield and hammer. The hero had no time to rest, because other goblins began to run up to him to avenge his defeated brothers. And then the barbarian noticed that the problem was in the number of monsters. There were only 10 goblins in one group, and if the number did not exceed 5, Bjorn I could easily deal with them. Injuries in this battle could not have been avoided if he had not had an ally who had already taken a position and began to shoot at all targets, helping in the battle from afar, as discussed. The battle was over, and the main character calculated that he received 11 crystals at a time, when in a whole day on the first floor he could only get 44, which was already a huge difference. He gave 2 crystals to the fairy, because even if you can't really buy anything for 1 crystal, but for 2 it will definitely be enough for bread, which Erwin was also happy and proud of, since her work began to bear fruit. When they went 3 meters beyond the portal area, flocks of goblins began to appear every 5 minutes, which meant more money received. Among this group was one goblin archer who can suddenly disappear, which in the game was called camouflage. But a goblin with a disguise is not an obstacle for the barbarian, and he continued to fight with the goblins, scattering them in all directions with his hammer. In order not to get an arrow in the head from a goblin archer, this body would be easy enough to notice, and dodging would be a piece of cake. The goblin finally took off his disguise, which gave Bjorn the opportunity to attack and kill the insolent one, throwing him up with his shield with all his might. It was not a minute, but there was a battle for the entire 15 hours that the allies fought, and both were very tired, so it was decided to lie down to rest near the portal in order to be less visible to other goblins. Erwin asked for a blanket and a pillow and fell asleep very quickly due to the fatigue that had accumulated during these 15 hours of fighting monsters, but she was so tired that she began to snore, which surprised Bjorn. While they were fighting with the goblins and in between battles, the companions met other adventurers who walked in groups of 3-4 creatures. Among them, there were representatives of different races. In between, he realized that adventurers are even more dangerous than goblins, especially when the barbarian now has someone to worry about, because Erwin is beautiful enough to catch someone else's gaze, and she woke up joyfully after hearing the latter. The next day, the situation had not changed, and they continued to stumble across other groups of goblins and deal with them, receiving even more rewards than before. On the 5th day of their stay here, they also hunted and had a good rest. Nothing unusual happened. On the 7th day, they met more adventurers, but they were not at all willing to join the groups, given their past experience with people, since both were almost killed by those who agreed to look after them in a dream. At the end of the 8th day, they were still tired, but there was no point, since it was time to return to the 1st floor, and from there get back to Raphonia, where they could breathe out in peace. On the way back, they noticed that the traps had reappeared, indicating that the goblins had been reborn again and were roaming around somewhere, waiting for inexperienced adventurers. And so it was, because 150 meters from Bjorn and Erwin, there were indeed 10 goblins, among whom there were 2 archers, and everyone was having some interesting conversations in their native goblin language. Even if the monsters did not touch anyone, their happiness still did not last long, because an arrow suddenly flew into one of the goblins, when the rest were already scared and stood up to see the threat. The threat was right in front of their noses and stood like a mountain, which frightened the low monsters even more. And they no longer had the same desire to start fighting the barbarian, even if he had. Over all these times that he fought, the main character became a master in battles, and even began to compare himself with the popular figure in Hinduism, the 1,000-armed and 1,000-eyed Avalokiteshvara, given his calmness and reaction speed. Erwin is also used to knowing when and who to shoot at, so even though she said that there were 2 archers in the group, not a single arrow flew in his direction. He knew that the fairy could be completely trusted, and this time he praised the girl's work. So he asked why she didn't immediately say how she dealt with the archers, to which he received the answer that she wasn't sure if she killed the second one. But the battle went well. She even understood when it was better to remain silent, which showed Erwin's growth as a person, and which made Bjorn very happy that he had already begun to be proud of the girl as his ally. Suddenly, the fairy called the barbarian over, and pointed to the corpse of the goblin archer, which began to glow bright blue, which was not a common thing for monster corpses. This turned out to be a type of improvement in the character's characteristics due to the powers and additional characteristics of the former owner, the chance of which is very close to 0, and this improvement is called essence. Bjorn, shocked by such luck, allows Erwin to take the essence of the archer, and along the way explains that the essence will not turn her into a goblin, but will add additional characteristics and improve the basic ones. Perhaps, the barbarian thought, the stranger who was looking for them on the 1st floor could use the essence of the bestial monster to gain the same sense of hearing and smell, thanks to which he almost found them. Satisfied, Erwin asks if the companion needs the essence, and proudly declares that in this case he will take it for himself, and the main character does not mind since the archer's essence will not be able to help the barbarian much. The fact that the essence appeared still bothered the guy, and he decided that he would allow it to absorb the improvement under one condition. But they could not reach an agreement, as they heard footsteps behind them and turned around to look at the uninvited guests. These guests turned out to be other adventurers, with a crossbowman on their team, who noticed the light emanating from the essence and wanted to get it for themselves. This turned out to be the catch of Bjorn's luck, and while Erwin tried to defend her rights to the essence, the barbarian put his hands on her shoulders and asked her not to talk about anything, since he knew the best way to answer. The best answer in such a situation turned out to be to push the girl into the essence so that she would absorb the essence faster than other adventurers, which gave all the necessary characteristics only to Erwin, and now the essence could not be removed. But what can you do, since the barbarian and the fairy turned out to be much faster and got a boost for themselves, which greatly angered the adventurers. It was possible to play on this, and Bjorn did this, offering to attack them, since he immediately noticed that he was underestimated, so it was necessary to take advantage of his agility. After a couple of minutes, the main characters continued to run straight towards the portal that was supposed to send them back to the city. This time they were not going to waste their precious time on the goblins. The agility of the barbarian frightened the group of adventurers and they ran away, shouting for mercy. And the guy himself understood that they would have to meet again, since these adventurers also planned to return through the first floor. Erwin sensed a new group of goblins that were 50 meters away from them. But there was no way to get around since they had already been spotted. In an attempt to avoid a fight, Bjorn ordered the girl to also turn around and run in a different direction. But their attempt was cut short by an arrow from a crossbow, which would have hit the fairy if the barbarian had not pulled her back. As the guy found out, this was the plan of the adventurers they met earlier and who were still trying to get the essence, which is why they took advantage of the goblins, luring monsters to these drum heroes. It was necessary to come up with a new plan, so he immediately ordered the girl to use the power of the essence, which was activated at the request of the bearer, and increased the characteristics by several units, and added additional and unique abilities, such as camouflage. Bjorn gave his things to his friend and ran forward, and ordered her to find the crossbowman, but not to do anything until he gave a signal, which they never discussed. Some time passed and he killed half of the goblins with ease, albeit without Erwin's help. But a second group of monsters came running here. Since the adventurers did not appear after the shot, they should appear after he killed all the monsters, so he had to continue without rest. After some time, he began to lose his vigilance, and the goblin was able to inflict the first wound on him in the back, for which he was sent flying with the help of a shield. But no matter how hard the main character tried, the wounds became more and more numerous, and he was left without the girl's help, although he hoped that she could find their crossbowmen. From both sides, he noticed two arrows flying towards him, one from a goblin and the second from a crossbow, and he had to choose which one to defend against. The choice was made in favor of protection from an arrow from a crossbow, and an arrow from a bow hit him in the elbow and poisoned him thanks to the poison inside. He also had to make a choice between the hammer and the shield, since he could no longer use his left hand and it was numb. But the decision was obvious, and he threw the hammer on the ground, since the main problem was the adventurers, not the goblins. This did not change Bjorn's fighting spirit, and he continued to beat everyone like crazy, repelling more and more goblin attacks, and so on until the bitter end. The last pair of goblins were simply frightened by how the barbarian looked and ran away as fast as they could, which meant the end of the first battle and the beginning of the second, but with the adventurers. They came out with a smile on their faces and tried to kindly find out where Erwin and the essence had gone. The answer in the attack style turned out to be the barbarian's favorite, and he repeated it once again, making it clear that he would not give the girl away. But the head of the group did not let up, and with an evil smile reminded the main character that he had too many wounds, after which he promised that he would let the barbarian go if he told where the fairy with the essence was. Bjorn didn't like the idea, and he asked himself who this red-haired man even takes him for, since he believes that he will betray his comrade because of some kind of wounds. Since the negotiations failed, the time has come to take up the sword and show that the red-haired man was not going to joke. But the main character had another goal, namely, to quietly give a sign to Erwin so that she would understand him, and the others could not. Due to the fact that the time in the game was similar to the Middle Ages and he was reborn, living in the 21st century, the hero had one sign in his arsenal, the middle finger, which he wanted to show them from the first time the adventurers noticed the duo. The guys did not figure out what this sign was, and therefore were a little unsettled when the barbarian calmly raised his wounded hand and showed them this gesture. He will have to find out later whether Erwin understood or not. But now, to distract attention, he must start a battle with the adventurers themselves. After the first blow, the red-haired man could not cope with the barbarian's strength, so he called his stronger friend to fight while he tried to rest. Suddenly, the four who were fighting noticed an arrow flying towards them, and everyone tried to guess whether it was shot from a crossbow at Bjorn or at the red-haired one. The arrow could have hit the head of the team if the guy with the shield had not entered the battlefield in time, since earlier he just stood aside, as if waiting for Erwin's arrow. Bjorn did not like this move, and he had already decided that since his companion could not help, he would have to do everything himself. After a short speech about how the group was fighting not just a barbarian, but a huge monster, two free people tried to attack the main character from different sides. The leader was the first to hit the jaw. Due to a strong blow from the barbarian, he was thrown a meter or even two away from the enemy and his allies. At that moment, the second tried to pierce Bjorn with his katana, and what a surprise he was when he was able to jump away from the attacker at the last moment. After several jumps back, Bjorn continued to dodge and attack enemies. A new arrow flew towards the katana bearer, but it was intercepted by a guy with a shield, whose main advantage, the shield, immediately burst into flames, which was definitely the work of Erwin herself. This moment could be used, and the barbarian ran towards the two still living adventurers, while the guy with the shield took out his sword and prepared to attack. And then the protagonist's companion overtook them and pierced his shoulder with her arrow, leaving him unarmed for some time. The only one who could still fight rushed forward at Bjorn as he expertly parried his attacks with his shield. The outcome of the battle was not in their favor, so the leader ran away from the battlefield in an attempt to find Erwin, which scared the barbarian a little. But ultimately, he trusted the girl and turned all his power and fury on the last two. The next moment he tried to hit the enemy standing opposite him, but he arched his back and dodged, but his comrade with the shield could not do this, so the man and the barbarian were left alone in this battle. In order to knock the last warrior off his feet, he had to resort to a maneuver. Bjorn took the shield and showed as if he wanted to hit, but instead he threw the shield at this adventurer, and he fell to the ground. It was useless to wait for mercy when the barbarian, in a fit of anger, grabbed the old man's throat and chewed off part of the flesh, finishing off the adventurer. When the battle was over, Erwin ran as fast as she could to her companion, pleased that her partner was alive, and handed him a vial of restoration potion so that the barbarian would drink the potion instead of watering each wound separately. The sensations were even worse than the first time, because now his organs began to boil from this. But the main character changed the topic and asked what time it was. And in response, the fairy said that only 10 minutes had passed. There was still a chance to get to first floor. But they had to hurry, so the barbarian and the fairy agreed to take only the weapons and backpacks with things, and had to leave the clothes here, since they would not have time to take them off. After almost 30 minutes, they finally reached the portal, and jumped into it at the last moment, moving to the first floor, from where they could exit to the outside world. The portal spat them out just like the first time, and although Erwin was able to stay on her feet, and felt joy when the end of their adventure began to approach, Bjorn fell again, but at least not from a bird's eye view, as the first time. At the last moment, the fairy remembered that the guy wanted to ask her for something, to which Bjorn replied that he wanted to see the girl in the Black Whale Tavern tonight, when the friends leave the labyrinth to the outside world. So they moved one by one back to the city of Raphonia, where they could breathe a sigh of relief because it was more or less safe here. In the labyrinth, time did not pass like in the city, which is why he immediately set the clock to noon, since, in any case, no matter how much time you spend in the labyrinth, you return to noon the next day. The voice of the second barbarian besides Bjorn was heard along the street, and it was the loyal ally of the main character, Karak, who began to warmly greet his friend. Very soon, as Karak started talking, more and more people began to approach him, who were glad that Karak remained alive, while our main character constantly stood on the sidelines and silently watched. Very quickly, the company decided to hold a duel at the control point, where the whole pack of warriors, together with Bjorn, headed, shouting different things to the floor of the street. At the checkpoint, a count of all the crystals obtained by the adventurer during his stay in the labyrinth took place, and, fortunately for this woman, by duel we meant a count, where the one with the most loot won. It was Bjorn's turn, and he put his several bags on the table and began to wait for the final figure. And as it turned out, the woman was a master in speed calculation, and soon announced the figure of 18,000 crystals. The entire horde of barbarians began shouting his name and calling him the best warrior, because his amount of crystals broke all previous records and, no matter how, he returned with other additional things. The barbarian understood that he was the first of their race who was able to enter the labyrinth as a savage and emerge as an intelligent member of society, also with boots and a hammer. So under the influence of his surroundings, he himself cheered up, rejoicing for himself. As in the most ancient traditions of the barbarians, they began to throw him up and glorify him, which Bjorn was still pleased with, and no one even paid attention to the surroundings, which were wondering what they were doing. Bjorn decided to move and, for now, sit and wait with the rest of the barbarians for those still at the checkpoint, so as not to miss any important point that the guy might not know about. Suddenly, Bjorn noticed Irvin, who had met with another group of seemingly intelligent and cold fairies and was already talking about her adventures in the labyrinth, since it was her first experience. The company the girl found herself in looked much smarter than the company of barbarians, which made him even envy her and her luck. After exchanging a few glances, they quietly agreed to meet that night and both whispered about it, not making themselves heard. But both sides noticed this, and one of the fairies asked if Irvin knew this barbarian, to which she answered in the negative and tried to change the topic. Kanak asked Bjorn the same thing, trying to look at the fairy, to which the main character answered even more sharply. But this also meant no. The situation between the races became so tense that even ordinary people were afraid to pass by, lest they get hit in the face by one of them, while Irvin and Bjorn simply watched in silence everything that was happening. Luckily for the guy, all the barbarians that were at the checkpoint came out, and the barbarians were able to leave without a fight between the races, and they left while the main character looked around, watching other people. The boy hugs his father, who has just returned from the labyrinth with tears in his eyes, and both are happy about this meeting. The others were also happy, like two brothers, one of whom had also just returned. And in the same way the grandmother met her son, just as glad that he was alive. But on the other side of the same coin there remains grief, despair, and sadness for all those who died, as well as for the husband who will not be able to see his beloved again. So many lost brothers, sisters, children, or even parents, and everyone was killed by the one who was no longer there. The guy walks past all the grieving people and notices that such suffering gives him a strange feeling, even though he has seen it 100 times through a screen with 2D graphics. But in reality, it brings completely different sensations. Very quickly, the sad atmosphere was replaced by drinking and joyful cries of barbarians throughout the tavern, who were simply glad to have survived. The main character was not happy about the drink because he believed that he might miss some necessary ritual, and that was the only reason he stayed close to them. But the only necessary step for the barbarians was the most ordinary drink. This greatly infuriated the guy, and he put his hands on the table, trying to say as calmly as possible that he was leaving, as he was in a hurry to get somewhere. But the company could not do anything, and simply saw it off with positive shouts and glorification of the new most powerful warrior, Bjorn, who tried to escape quietly, which, to put it mildly, did not work out. Walking through the streets of the city, the main character could not help but feel some kind of emptiness inside himself, since during these so-called 7 days he got used to the fact that you always need to be on your guard. But Raphonia has its own laws, and no one will try to kill you for the thirst for profit. Bjorn bought himself a shirt and went to the hotel to rent a room and finally rest after all these adventures, which could have cost both him and his companion their lives. In order to somehow freshen up and rid himself of annoying thoughts, he decided to take a shower, but even warm water did not help calm down. Immediately after the shower, he fell onto the bed and exhaled, feeling enormous fatigue, which should have turned off his thoughts and allowed him to sleep peacefully, without worrying about anything. But one thought had already settled in his head and continued to torment him for a long time, and it was the desire to get home, even if no one was waiting for the guy there, and even if the hero was not welcome there, and he would live worse there than here. At 9 o'clock in the evening, he woke up and clasped his hands, waking up. Later he calculated that he slept for about 4 to 5 hours, since he left the labyrinth at lunchtime, and now he could go to meet Irwin at the Black Whale Tavern. A new problem arose from where no one expected it, and as it turned out, such a tavern has not existed for 10 years, due to the fact that the son of its owner became interested in gambling and lost the tavern. As it turned out, the time in the game and the time of this reality really lagged behind. And now the place that Bjorn knew about from the game was called Python's Bounds, and the fact that he was able to read this inscription assured him that he would need to go to the library to find the information you need. As soon as the guy entered the tavern, he was immediately greeted by a cheerful atmosphere, good drinks, and soon he noticed Irwin and another fairy, with whom his companion had been talking before. And the woman was clearly not happy about the meeting, while she kept a serious face, studying the barbarian from head to toe. Bjorn introduced himself first, after which he asked the stranger what her name was, and who she was to his ally, who turned out to be Irwin's older sister and introduced herself as Tercia, not wanting to give her full name. The barbarian asked why she was here, to which the elder sister put her hands on the table and leaned closer to him, asking for what reason he invited such a young girl to such a place, and even for the night. Tercia briefly reminded him that the guy himself asked Erwin to come to this tavern, and now asks why she, as an older sister, stands up for her relatives. But the main character was more unsettled by the words about the fact that he called Erwin last night, and not this noon. Bjorn, pretty lost in time, turned to Erwin and asked how many hours ago they left the labyrinth, to which she replied that it was not about 4 to 5 hours, as he thought, but about 30 hours. That is, without noticing it, he slept the whole day and did not show up at the appointed time, and that was the only reason he was able to feel so rested, and this upset him, since he was the one who insisted on this meeting. Consumed by a sense of guilt, he immediately apologized to his partner, honestly admitting that he had overslept, which frightened Tercia, since she did not at all expect that an apology was typical of barbarians, considering that she and the fairies were enemies. Tercia quickly put this moment aside and asked why the barbarian had to call her younger sister here, even at night, already thinking about changing her opinion towards him a little. But instead of answering, with which he could grovel, he spat on personal connections and stuck his finger in her ear, openly showing his disrespect for her, and then added that if she was so interested, let Erwin ask herself. The guy spoiled her mood, and she returned to her mode of hatred of barbarians, since he, too, she believed, did not shine with intelligence, since he did not even want to answer her question normally. And so their angry gatherings continued, this time exchanging various jokes and reproaches, while Erwin tried to calm both of them down and not let the situation escalate, since it was obvious that she was having a hard time among her fighting friends. This could have gone on for an eternity, as both sides had something to say about each other. But Tercia broke the chain by placing in front of the barbarian a bag containing 350,000 crystals, his share of what Erwin received from selling the essence. But Bjorn did not accept such a generous gift, and this forced the girl to ask why the guy needed the fairy's younger sister, to which he turns to his friend and asks what she herself thinks about this, to which Erwin cannot come up with a good answer. The main character explains that the deal through which she received the essence was that they would continue to cooperate with each other if Erwin helped him finish off the required amount of crystals. Tercia explained to the guy that now the girl would go with her sister to the labyrinth, since this plan had been brewing for a long time, and no matter how happy Erwin was with Bjorn's offer, she could not change her mind and therefore apologized to Bjorn. Trying to keep the conversation going, the main character asks whether this bag is half of all the profits, to which Tercia nods, and Bjorn reminds him that according to the agreement, he gets 90% of the entire amount. The elder sister had prepared for this, so with a sly smile she placed another bag full of crystals next to her, while Bjorn begins to notice that he now understands why barbarians do not like fairies, because he just almost became deceived himself. Erwin bursts into the conversation and asks his sister to give the girl the opportunity to say goodbye to Mr., since they spent quite a lot of time together, and she would like to thank her partner for everything they went through. Tercia finally remembers that her little sister is no longer 5 years old, even though she is only 21, and agrees to give them some free time. But before leaving, she almost ordered the barbarian to swear on his military honor that he would not sleep with her sister, from which she was surprised just like the main character. But the request did not frighten him, because the guy didn't give a damn about military honor even before the situation. So without further ado, he swore not to do anything bad, joking in his head that, based on the words of Tercia herself, everything else is permitted. In the end, Tercia gets up satisfied, turns around and leaves, since she has already fulfilled her sisterly duty, and now the calm Bjorn and the Erwin sisters, alarmed by this behavior, will be able to have their conversation. Before leaving the tavern, the girl also decided to be kinder to the barbarian, and thanked him for the fact that the barbarian did not abandon Erwin and even saved her. And as confirmation of the sincerity of the words, she repeated his full name. Now the former allies were left alone, and the main character assured his friend that Tercia would not be angry with her sister for the first time she went against her will, and suggested moving the topic in a different direction. Erwin put a couple more bags on the table, saying that she took them out of the backpacks of the crossbowman and the red-haired one, since she still had things that were too much to bring here, so Erwin offers to go to her tomorrow and pick them up. In between, the girl reminds her friend that she promised to repay him for saving him, and asks if the hero has something in mind about this, while the barbarian finally realizes the reason why the older sister came in the first place. And Tercia was simply worried that the barbarian would ask something out of the ordinary. Since there were no ideas, the main character offered to take something to eat, but the girl was not hungry, so she refused to eat in this tavern. She had plans to share her first alcoholic drink with Bjorn after leaving the labyrinth, because this time was her first. That's why the tradition was called that, and alcohol was called the first return drink. As Erwin learned, she would still be able to share the first return drink with Bjorn, since their adventure turned out to be his first. So they exchanged praises and began to drink in honor of their first trip to the labyrinth. After some time, the girl began to get a little drunk, while the guy continued to pour alcohol into himself without any consequences, and thinking about how the fairy could repay him for saving him. Later, a plan came to mind, and he told Erwin about it, but noted that it was better not to do this in the tavern, otherwise they would come for them. So the girl offers to go to the barbarian's room, and he happily agrees. But only the fairy had plans to spend a romantic evening, until the barbarian began to try to break her arm. But after some time he realized that he was using too much force and gave the girl a break. While she sat down and began to worry and ask again whether her hand was alive, and whether she herself had died, Bjorn thought about who had a ploy-for flexibility characteristic that was almost invisible in this reality. The three main characteristics in the game where he ended up were strength, spirit, and endurance. But besides them, there was a whole bunch of other characteristics, the values of which distinguished warriors with three identical numbers in the main characteristics. The essence that Erwin absorbed enhanced several of her stats and made her stronger. But there was also one stat that he couldn't understand, the effect of which he couldn't understand, namely, possession. The main character asked Erwin if anything had changed after returning from the labyrinth, and the girl said that she ate a lot of cookies, although she never really liked them, and this led Bjorn to the idea that obsession increases desire. The research could have continued if the fairy had not begun to get tired, so she asked the guy to lie down to sleep, which he could not refuse her. So the two fell asleep on the same bed, while the barbarian thought about the words of Tertia, who warned him that the main character should not sleep with Erwin, but most likely the dream meant something else, so he fell asleep calmly. The night passed calmly, and both slept, after which they were able to bring all the things of the killed adventurers to Bjorn's room, and they thought to sell most of it, except for the leather suit and belt, since Erwin decided to keep it for herself. After a couple of minutes, they sold everything at good prices, and together earned 1,450,000 crystals, which both were very surprised and happy about. No matter how good they were together, the time had come to say goodbye. But still the main character offered to walk a little, since they were in the same direction, while Erwin was already starting to miss the way they fought together. Passing through the center of the city, they noticed a huge crowd that had gathered in front of the guillotine, for reasons unknown to the barbarian and the fairy. As it turned out, at that moment, there was an execution of people who did not kill, did not loot, and did not do anything bad, but could not pay the taxes of Raphonia, which is why they ended up here. We learn that the city of Raphonia is the last place on Earth that somehow survived the witch's curse, but was left without resources in the outside world, so the only option to earn at least something was the labyrinth. When the head of the first culprit was cut off, the crowd, out of their minds, ran one after the other to the scene of the murder, with loaves of bread in their hands. Having reached the guillotine, people began to smear bread in the blood of the deceased and eat it as quickly as possible, without even leaving the place. This scared both of them, and Erwin asked the reason why people do this, to which Bjorn replied that there is a belief that the blood of the murdered person will lead to financial wealth. The guy asked his friend what the tax was for the first month, and the number turned out to be 700,000 for non-humans, and for the next month the tax increases by 100,000, but a commission is also added when transferring the amount. This technique was only created in order to reduce the number of hungry mouths, so such executions were always happening, and the rest had no choice but to go into the labyrinth and fight to survive. The barbarian decided that the best option would be to get to the 6th floor next time, so that he could earn more and not worry about his future, or to escape to reality while there was time. After some time, Bjorn went to the library to get more information about this world, and as soon as he entered this institution, he immediately caught several glances from people who did not expect to see a barbarian in the library. But he was not the only one, because at one of the tables his old friend, the barbarian Einar, was already sitting and sleeping. Bjorn woke up the girl by putting his hand on her shoulder and tried to interrogate her what she was doing here. Einar quickly realized the situation and smiled brightly, loudly telling her friend how glad she was that he was also alive, which is why the others paid attention to the barbarians. But the girl did not care. She said that she remembered Bjorn's words about what she needed to think about and came to the library to read a book. And, as it turned out, she didn't even know how to read. But the fact that she tried already deserved recognition. Einar sighed and also said that her situation with other adventurers was also not successful, so she decided to start studying and will now go to the temple to learn how to read and write. Bjorn wished him luck in this, and the girl remembered that she wanted to repay the guy for his wisdom and told him to come to the Raging Bull Tavern in 2 days, where Einar would do everything possible to help him, which Bjorn was damn happy about, since he would really need help. Now that he was left alone with the library, he wondered where to look for the books he needed, because the room was simply huge, and without help, he would not be able to find anything. Looking around, he noticed a girl who was sleeping at the table and was not paying attention to anyone, and Bjorn had to wake her up. Fortunately, there is also a librarian in this world, albeit a sleepy one. So before she fell asleep, the main character approached her to ask for a book. Not intending to listen to him, the girl read a strange spell, and a light appeared in her hands, which also touched the barbarian's chest, as if she was using her power on him. But in appearance, nothing had changed. And the girl, yawning, replied that the best option would be to wander around the library and definitely find something. She also repeated that you couldn't take books with you, and after reading you should put them back, and fell asleep again. As it turned out, the girl's magic still worked. Namely, it illuminated the book the guy needed with a light purple glow, which he definitely couldn't pass by. So he chose the first book to read. The first book told about the fallen world, that is, a world that suffered from the curse of witches and was uninhabitable. The only city that remained intact and was able to survive the disaster was the city of Rathonia. Due to the fact that many began to die from lack of resources, the strongest magicians created a portal to the world of the labyrinth, so that there would be a chance to earn money and survive with their family, and not worry about anything. The second book about alchemy told how crystals earned in the labyrinth could be turned into pieces of bread, metal, or gold, which seemed useful to the main character, although incomprehensible. The next book was of more interest to him and talked about such a phenomenon as evil spirits. That is, the souls of players who moved into the bodies of barbarians for reasons unknown to anyone and seized control. Also, the government fought against this phenomenon all the time, so Bjorn did not must allow people to reveal themselves. The penultimate book was able to explain to the barbarian what time he was in, since the game began with the death of the immortal king, Revision 3, when, as here, 150 years had passed since the events of the prologue, which explained the inconsistency between the game and reality. The last book talked about the spatial instability that can appear at the moment the portal closes and send a person to the dark zone of the first floor. And from this, it follows that the reason Bjorn ended up in the dark zone was his own actions. Only then did the main character notice that it was already very dark outside, so it was time to pack up and return home. The guy returned home and lay down on the bed, thinking that only 3 days had passed since returning from the labyrinth, and that a month here lasts 30 days. The portal opens on the 1st, so he has 27 days left, and tomorrow he will look for allies, so as not to go alone again. In the morning, he was awakened by the painfully familiar voice of Erwin, who stood outside the door and knocked on his door, trying to wake up her friend. As soon as the barbarian opened the door and asked why she came here, a very strong wind hit him in the face, which literally could not have appeared in the room just like that. The culprit was Erwin herself, who said that she was able to enter into a contract with the spirit of the wind, and can now use its power in battles, taking into account the fact that fire and wind are excellent allies when together. She did this with the help of magical contracts, which are expensive and at the same time have only a 10% chance of a successful contract, and Erwin spent 10 of them given to her by Tertia. The news was joyful, but Bjorn asked her to call the spirit away, which made both the spirit and the fairy sad, since they had not yet shown him everything, and he already had something to show in response, namely the room in which complete chaos began to reign due to the powers of the spirit of the wind. The girl very quickly realized the situation and apologized, saying that she would now call the spirit away and clean up his room after herself, which she subsequently did, also quite quickly. Now that they can talk normally, the barbarian congratulated the girl on the new, successful conclusion of the contract, since this is a very good strengthening, and then asked why she comes here every time something happens, although they have not been allies for a long time. The barbarian was her first partner and first friend, so the fairy felt a certain connection between them and ran as fast as she could to her friend, so that he would be the first to know about everything. So Bjorn decided that so be it and decided to maintain friendly ties. Another day passed, and in the evening the main character went to the Raging Bull Tavern, where all the barbarians were staying, including Einar, who was exactly what he needed. One of the barbarians tried to persuade Bjorn to move in with them, since the rooms here were much cheaper, even though the barbarians had to sleep 5 people in a room. But he dodged it, saying that he just came to visit Einar. The girl also noticed her friend and came up to ask why Bjorn was looking for her, to which he replied that he wanted to train with Einar to improve her skills, since her fellow tribesman was much stronger than him in strength. The only problem was that all the seats on the training field were already filled with other barbarians who were fighting each other. But this did not bother Bjorn, and he said that he would like to fight her right now. The main character had no intention of losing, but Einar literally defeated him in a couple of minutes, and he didn't even notice how he was lying on the ground, crushed by a girl who was stronger than him. But this only meant that he had something to learn from his girlfriend. So the barbarian wiped the blood from his nose and asked to fight again, and the girl did not mind. The second time was no luck either, and he threw back his shield when she started to hit him, and he lost again. The next time, he began to somehow fight off her attacks and lasted even longer, although he still lost and asked for revenge. So they fought the whole evening, until night fell and both were exhausted. So it was decided to continue tomorrow, when both would rest and be able to continue the exercises. Before saying goodbye and leaving, Bjorn asked Einar if she had any allies for the next trip to the labyrinth, to which she replied that she was not even going to organize a team, as she had financial problems. It would have been a sin not to take advantage of the situation and not offer her his candidacy, Bjorn thought, and noted that he would take 80% of the spoils for himself, but would also pay for the needs of the team. The girl was not yet strong in numbers, let alone the percentages that the guy was talking about. So she abruptly shut him up and shook his hand, saying that she would only be glad to cooperate with Bjorn in the labyrinth. He liked the girl's attitude, and the guy said that he would also be glad to work together, since Einar was definitely smarter than the other barbarians, and certainly would not betray, so now he could be calm because he had found an excellent ally. The next day, the 2 barbarians returned to the temple to the elder, whom Bjorn did not particularly like and favor because of the situation with the evil spirit at the warrior initiation ceremony. When Einar and the hero turned 18, the elder suggested that the barbarian decided to follow in the footsteps of Einar and learn to read as well as write, but the main character replied that he had come for a spiritual seal, which was called the Seal of the Immortal, and was a prerequisite for easy progress in the labyrinth. The elder was wary, since beginners and inexperienced warriors very rarely know about this seal of the spirit. So he asked the barbarian directly how he knew what Bjorn had prepared for, and replied that he had read in a book about the war between fairies and barbarians, where this seal played a huge role. The lie worked, and the elder even patted the guy on the back, expressing his pride in him and Iron, who began to become smarter day by day, and the thirst for knowledge is not very often seen among barbarians. But before giving the required seal to the guy, the elder demanded 800,000 stones for it, putting it more like a test, because immediately after he asked whether he could bear that price. And Bjorn was ready for this, which surprised Einar very much, because newcomers don't earn that much, even after one trip to the labyrinth. But the barbarian did not deviate from his plan, and provided the elder with 1 bag with 500,000 crystals, and 3 with 100,000. The elder, who did not expect this, asked again how he managed it, which the main character was very happy about, since he even came up with a plausible story that plays on the barbarian's hatred of fairies. He left the beginning present and said that he found a lonely and wounded fairy who was hiding from other adventurers, and the barbarian took advantage of this. He made her his slave and forced her to fight, after which he took away all the stones, leaving nothing for the fairy. The end of the plan was the moment with the essence, which he gave to Erwin, and then forced her older sister to pay for the essence. The story turned out to be both plausible and just to the taste of not only the elders, but also the rest of the barbarians who gathered to hear about it. The same story made the elder think and give him 200,000 crystals as a gift, in recognition of the guy's potential, which greatly pleased the main character, and he began to find some kind of charm in the barbarians. Spiritual seal is one of the ways to improve a barbarian's body, which consists of using the necessary tattoos to improve certain characteristics. The spiritual seal can only be chosen once, so the shaman asks Bjorn if he is ready and if he is confident in his choice to the end. But the barbarian is not going to deviate from his plans. But the tattoo brings the same pain, especially when the shaman began to use a needle larger than the main character had seen in his world. Several hours passed and the session in the tattoo parlor came to an end. So the barbarian thanked the shaman and was about to leave when he heard a laugh from behind, so he automatically asked what was so funny. The shaman answered the question that he had never heard or seen a shaman being thanked for a tattoo before. This moment frightened the main character, since he had no desire to show off and stand out at all. So he silently left the shaman's hut, trying to understand whether thank you was actually something bad. The next day, he went to the market to prepare for a new trip to the labyrinth, because the hammer did not suit him, and training with Einar showed that the sword was not suitable, even more so. So his choice fell on the middle mace. Along with the weapon, he bought a cheap custom-made helmet and a breastplate, so that he could fight even better and not worry about protecting himself. So the days passed and everything became a pleasant routine. And so every morning he woke up and went down to have breakfast with Erwin, who still runs contentedly to him despite the fact that she herself lives far away. He spends up to 4 hours in the library searching for the necessary information, while his head is tormented by the question of why the librarian always sleeps at work. After 4, he has a free hour, and he goes to new places, simultaneously listening to some news in search of new information that is interesting to him. Well, after that, Bjorn returns to the Raging Bull Tavern, where he continues to train with the rest of the barbarians to increase his characteristics, such as endurance, strength, and even flexibility. A week of battles with Einar was enough for him to be able to fight with the rest of the barbarians, and even sometimes defeat Einar herself. And in the evening, the hero returns to his hotel, washes himself and meets Erwin again, who tells him about everything she learned and asks him about his day. At the end of one of these days, she said goodbye, and wished good luck tomorrow in the labyrinth. And Bjorn only realized that time had passed so quickly that there was only one day left before the portal opened. Therefore, the next day, Einar and Bjorn got together and went to the researcher's house, where they asked for a sacred bond for 2. A sacred bond is a one-time effect of connecting 2 or more people, giving them the opportunity to appear in one place in the labyrinth, even if it costs 150,000 crystals, which could buy a whole mountain of meat. During the conversation, the woman called the barbarians adventurers of the 9th rank, so Bjorn asked how she determined this, to which the woman replied that the main indicator of rank is the amount of essence in the soul, but said nothing more and let go. In honor of the beginning of their adventure, the main character bought the most expensive dinner in a tavern for 800,000 crystals, which greatly surprised and delighted the new ally. So much so that she asked 3 times if she was dreaming about it. The barbarian's companion's new favorite food was cream pie, which she began to eat as if she was crazy, and continued to rejoice like a child while she set herself the goal of always earning enough to always be able to afford such dinners. When dinner was over, they immediately went to the portal, which had just begun to open, so they had some time left before entering. Not far from them, a second group of barbarians appeared, who were initiated into warriors and would go through the labyrinth for the first time. This brought some nostalgia to Einar, which Bjorn did not understand since their initiation was only a month ago. Finally, the portal to the labyrinth was open, and the adventurers were able to enter it. But the main character suggested that the girl wait a little and come back later. Even though Einar didn't understand why this was necessary, the feeling of trust was much stronger, and she agreed to wait a while. We had to wait longer than Einar had expected, and the passage had already begun to be closed. And what was her surprise, when the wise man said that it was not time to enter yet, and that we needed to wait some more. And then it was announced that the portal began to close, so both rushed from their place and ran through the night into the portal to get into the labyrinth. As it turned out, the instability of the spaces helped them end up in the same place where the main character was thrown the first time, namely into darkness. Fortunately for Einar, Bjorn took a torch with him, so they were able to see in the darkness a stone slab, which was a button to open a portal that had not yet been activated by anyone. Since Einar and Bjorn were the first to find this place, it was they who had the honor of opening the passage, so a light touch of their hand to the slab was enough, and the portal to the second floor opened, and they could pass through it. The portal led them to the second floor, but to another zone, which was called the Lands of the Dead, where a variety of unrestrained souls lived, such as ghouls, mutants, skeletons, and similar monsters. At one point, Bjorn felt something strange flowing through his veins, but such a feeling appeared for the first time, and he asked Einar about it, who replied that this was a sign of an increase in the level of the soul, or the level of the character. The girl was tormented by the question that his level increased before he killed someone else. So the barbarian explains to his companion the reason, because they were the first to find the portal. And this is an achievement, an experience for raising the level. What was called experience for the player here had a different name, namely an achievement, which also had oddities in its mechanics. Namely, experience can only be gained when you kill some monster for the first time, and when you kill it again, experience is not awarded. Bjorn asked his ally to remain silent about their secret way to go straight to the portal, and they decided to move on, since there was little point in staying. In order to free his hands, Bjorn tied the torch to his helmet, still struggling with the feeling of strangeness of the situation, even though all adventurers have been doing this for a long time. But Einar is not against this. He only notes that the idea is really good, because the torch is magical and nothing won't burn. In the lands of the dead, there are a variety of types of monsters that are stronger opponents, and there are simply more of them, and they are different from each other. But even if the enemies were stronger, this did not stop Einar from dealing with the entire crowd of ghouls that was running towards them. A little later, they heard a strange hum that came from afar, in which the frightened girl called a strange cry that makes the blood run cold, while her companion was only surprised at her friend's fear. Fear forced her to tightly hug the guy by the throat, but she could not be afraid for long because of the crowd of skeletons that ran at them from several directions and forced both of them to do something. Einar tried to make amends to Bjorn and ran towards the skeletons with her sword, while her ally advised her to hit the core that was between their ribs. But her attacks were strong enough to break each skeleton into a pile of bones without targeting any one point. During the entire time they were here, they met ghouls and their older brothers, who were more powerful than the ghouls themselves. The same thing happened with the skeletons, who were rotten monsters of other types and still owned some types of weapons. Here the main character was able to fully experience the power of his new clothes, which changed the course of the battle and helped him fight even more aggressively, since he did not have to worry about his safety. And in the same way, he was helped by the same strong barbarian girl, who could kill several enemies at once with one blow. They turned out to be an excellent team, and he liked being with another barbarian more than with the fairy, since she couldn't keep up with him. At one point, Bjorn noticed that the ground had changed and was no longer wet and sticky as before, but rather dry and hard, which foreshadowed a meeting with an 8th rank monster, a rank higher than the monsters they had fought before. And as soon as the main character remembered about the 8th rank monster, they noticed a death demon who came right up to them, which was strange, because such a huge monster could not remain unnoticed for long. There was no other choice but to fight the demon together, so the guy immediately said that their main target was the monster's head, because there was no point in hitting the rest of the body due to the strength of the body. Einar immediately jumped and tried to reach the demon's head, but he used his hand to block the blow, so everything fell into Bjorn's hands. But he also failed to hit at the right time, and had to jump back as far as possible to avoid being killed. Einar took advantage of this moment and delivered a strong blow near the neck of the death demon, trying to inflict a deep wound. But this creature's body was too strong, so the sword did not even get stuck in its neck, but only left a small scratch. The girl also received a blow from the demon, which made her fly straight towards Bjorn, and she somehow managed to land on her feet. This monster turned out to be too durable to break through so easily, and the wounds they inflicted on it healed very quickly, which only worsened the situation. The next moment, the demon let out a roar louder than before. Bjorn and Einar were not only frightened, but also noticed how the creature, thanks to its roar, used one active skill. This skill summoned a whole crowd of ghouls from underground, who ran towards the main characters, just like the demon himself. This time, Bjorn decided that he would distract the demon while Einar dealt with the ghouls, so he ran forward, dodging the monster's attacks. In the same way, he jumped back the second time when the death demon tried to hit him with his hand again. The next moment, several blows swirled around the demon and Bjorn, killing all the ghouls in the shortest possible time. It turned out to be Einar who figured out her part of the job and tried to help him with the most important problem. Einar was able to hit him in the head again, diverting all attention to herself and giving her ally time to strike. Bjorn, who reacted in time, grabbed the mace and hit it again, now doing more damage than he could have done with a hammer. The monster began to lose its balance while the barbarians tried to make the final and decisive blow. But the regeneration was faster, so the demon managed to hit the barbarian first, from which he flew back and fell on his back, thinking that such a blow could easily kill the goblin, but not this demon of death. The monster quickly continued to recover, and was about to continue attacking both barbarians, while Bjorn remembered that everything in the game was not so bad, and tried to come up with a plan for destruction. Einar overtook the monster and grabbed his leg, trying to throw him to the ground so that they could finish him off with less effort. Bjorn really liked the idea, and he kicked the demon's second leg, forcing him to fall to the ground. The demon was now helpless, and tried to move to get up and fight off the two adventurers, still screaming in rage, but very pleased with the victory and angry because of so many blows. The barbarians had already raised their weapons and prepared to beat the crap out of the demon. Here, the joy of both knew no bounds, and both smiled while they hit the monster's face with all their might, comparing the feeling to how the protagonist and his friends used to hit rice cakes when they went on school trips. After the demon's body disappeared, the only thing that remained was the same crystal, but larger, since it was a rank 8 crystal. Einar picked up the stone to take a closer look, while Bjorn surprises with the fact that one such crystal costs only 100 ordinary ones. And together with the ghouls, the barbarians earned all 300, which still did not justify the risk of lives. The girl continued to examine the stone and asked her friend how much he bought that strange white cheese, which was actually a cream pie, and answered that it cost about 300 crystals. The taste of cream pie turned out to be not only an excellent motivator to fight, but also an excellent option for calculating Einar, who said that killing 3 of the same demons would be enough for her to buy the pie. The hunt continued, and they began to hunt only the demons of death, since they already knew the tactics against them, which greatly simplified the work, because it was enough to first knock them down and then hit them with all their might. Simply beating the demon's head like a punching bag brought indescribable joy to both of them. And Bjorn said that he felt his childhood traumas healing when Einar cried in joy. After that, they decided to find a place and lie down to sleep, while the main character began to reflect on how lucky he was to meet another strong barbarian, since they made a great team. The next day, demons began to appear in pairs, intending to eat Bjorn and Einar. It is enough to simply knock down the first demon, and then do the same with the second and finish off both. But the main thing is to defeat the demons of death in time. Otherwise, the barbarian and Einar will have to flee again from a double crowd of ghouls, which they will no longer be so easy to defeat. As early as noon, the demons began to increase in numbers and began to walk in groups of 3, which made the adventurers' hunt even more difficult. So they decided to look for another place. So the end of the second day approached and the hunt stopped completely. So the main characters found a great place to spend the night and were already getting ready to lay out their things near this wall. But they were immediately met by 3 other adventurers, who were also looking for a place to rest. Neither of the adventurers said a word. They took a mouthful of water as soon as they noticed the 2 huge barbarians. Bjorn decided to take the initiative into his own hands and tried to drive away the adventurers with his serious and scary voice. But his words quickly dissolved under the yoke of the embittered Einar, who immediately reached out for her sword, simultaneously threatening each of the adventurers. The words and appearance of the girl frightened the whole company, and they ran away as quickly as they could, so as not to accidentally fall under the hot hand of the barbarian. This could not end well. So Einar immediately said that staying in one place is dangerous, since now there are adventurers who know about them, and was the first to suggest finding another place to stay for the night. Bjorn noticed that Einar turned out to be smarter even when she spoke about distrust of other researchers, because before he had only heard about the achievements of the other barbarians, which made the main character think about the reason why the girl could not trust others in the labyrinth. So they walked for a whole hour in search of a more or less hidden place. But Einar began to be overcome by doubts that they would even be able to find something even similar to where they thought to stay. Their conversations were interrupted by someone's sudden cry, coming from the adventurer, but certainly not from the one who was attacked by the monsters, but, most likely, from his comrades, other adventurers. They decided to run closer and see what had happened, keeping their weapons ready, since they still did not know what danger awaited them. Very soon they noticed the shadow of a girl with a cloak, who was waving at them and calling them to come closer. Bjorn quickly analyzed the situation and noticed 4 corpses behind the girl, 3 of which were poisoned, and their bodies were without wounds, while the last one had a bloody stain on his chest. This only made the barbarians more wary, and they took a defensive position, watching the girl, who, on the other hand, was very calm and did not make any sudden movements, but only spoke. The horror she saw, and the bloody knife in her hands was enough to understand that this girl was nothing more than a professional looter. Here, marauders are people who voluntarily kill people instead of monsters for the sake of obtaining the same profit, their crystals, their weapons, and their things. The girl already looked good at her job, and in the same way, she could not be executed in Raphonia due to the fact that no one knows about what is happening in the labyrinth. Einar begins to panic and clutches her sword tighter, telling her friend that she will be an even more dangerous opponent and definitely cannot be trusted. Bjorn looked towards the corpses and noticed that among them there was a high-level magician. Such adventurers could easily go to the 5th floor and kill everyone there, but they were killed at the hands of a marauder already on the 2nd floor. Bjorn asked the girl if these were her comrades, to which the girl replied that maybe these adventurers really considered the marauder their friend, while she reached for the sword of one of the dead adventurers and left her back open, since she was not at all afraid of newcomers. While she continued to speak, the main character and his girlfriend looked at each other with the question of whether they should fight her, or whether it would be better to try to leave while she doesn't see, because there are no guarantees that they will survive. The second option turned out to be more reliable, as the barbarians considered, so they quickly ran out of sight and away from the marauder, so that she could not reach them at least for a while. Staying on this floor was a bad idea, and they ran towards the portal following the marks on the stones that Bjorn left just in case, and they really came in handy right now during the escape. But their path was blocked by other 4 adventurers, who were themselves surprised that they met 2 barbarians here. Einar did not trust any of them, and continued to keep her hand on her sword in case of an unforeseen situation, while Bjorn tried to ask for help from these adventurers, since running away from the marauder was a disastrous proposition. The strangers agreed on the condition that if they killed that marauder, then they would take all the things of Bjorn and Einar, and one of the adventurers told the barbarians to get closer in order to use the dwarf skill, which is capable of masking all living creatures in the area of 3 meters. The barbarians agreed, and only then realized that they had fallen into the trap of exactly the same marauders, and now could not move. The remaining 3, who did not receive the effect of their abilities, began to walk around the group of newcomers, examining them and their things, while talking about the hearts of barbarians, which are selling very well. One of the adventurers was tasked with killing the barbarian outright, so he unsheathed his dagger and aimed straight at Bjorn's throat, who still couldn't move and couldn't say anything except watch. The effect of the ability turned out to be easily removed, because it was enough to receive the slightest damage, and then the effect would subside, which the main character took advantage of when the adventurer just started inserting a knife into his throat. At the penultimate moment, the guy leaned back to minimize the damage caused by the dagger, and to prevent him from being planted even deeper. Frightened by the survival of the newcomer, the rest of the marauder froze in place for a while, after which they ordered to kill him while there was time. Bjorn took the dagger from his throat and threw it towards Einar to slightly wound her and remove the effect from her. But the main character himself could no longer fight because of his wound, so he left everything else to the girl, and he himself began to slowly fall to the ground. Einar very easily and quickly dealt with 2 adventurers, almost sawing their bodies with her blow, but one was still able to escape, even if this did not upset Bjorn's companion, since now they needed to be together, especially considering the problems they got into. As soon as Einar turned towards her comrade, she was stunned by his condition, because she did not expect that the situation would be so bad and that he really began to die. And at that time the game awarded the main character an achievement for the remaining 0.1 units of health. Fortunately for both, they had a restoration potion on hand, so the wound was quickly treated and closed even faster. But even with this, the hero was left with a small scar on his neck. This did not bother Einar. On the contrary, she congratulated him, since not every barbarian has a scar on his neck, and he can now boast that he somehow escaped a mortal fate. Bjorn sighed and looked ahead, saying that they should catch up with that marauder who used the dwarf's ability on them, since he would be useful. They quickly found the fugitive and Einar was about to kill him, but the hero reminded them that the adventurer's ability could help them hide from the marauder. They were just about to agree when a poisoned dart flew into the marauder's neck, somehow missing the girl's hand. Since the distance between the hand and the dart was small, the lifeless body fell to the ground, and the barbarians took a step back in horror where the marauder stood calmly, whose poisoned dart killed the adventurer. While the marauder praised the barbarians for their battle, they realized that the escape would not be successful. There was no other choice, and since we couldn't escape, we would have to face the enemy, which is what our duo did, jumping onto the marauder. Einar was the first to attack and swung her sword, trying to wound the marauder, who ducked down at the last moment. Bjorn tried to hit the girl from behind, but she quickly dodged and blocked the attack with her knife. The hero suddenly threw down his weapon and tried to throw the enemy in the hope that she would lose her foothold and the barbarians could win. The marauder, with a slight movement of her hand, pierced his breastplate and planted a knife in his back, causing the guy to fall to the ground. Einar also tried to attack from behind and was ready to smash the adventurer with her 2-handed sword. The next moment, a knife blade passed across her skin, inflicting a deep wound, and the marauder jumped a couple of steps back from the barbarian. When the allies were exhausted, the marauder invited them to surrender, since the basilisk venom had already begun to spread through the bodies of the wounded. At one point, the girl took the knife tightly and at high speed brought it to Bjorn's chin, leaving him in fear for his life. The marauder explained that she was not going to kill them, so there was a chance to get out of here alive if the newcomers kept quiet about what they saw. Her goals never included killing the barbarians, as they had once done her a favor, and she had promised to preserve the lives of their race in return. Einar called out to Bjorn in her hoarse voice and advised her friend not to trust the marauder, as she could potentially lie. The barbarian took his friend's words seriously, and asked the girl what would happen if he refused to remain silent about what he had seen earlier. The answer was obvious, and the marauder said that then she would have to kill both barbarians, since she was not going to risk her life. Bjorn tried to ask who she promised that she would save the lives of the barbarians, but the stranger quickly interrupted and said that it was none of his business. There was no other way out, and he swore on his military honor that he would remain silent about this incident and would not tell anyone about it. The girl sighed and stood up to hide the knife while she said that he was somehow different from the other barbarians, which caught his interest. The marauder said nothing more and poured a certain amount of restoration potion on his neck, which again began to bring heat to his body. The stranger asked what Einar decided about this, who was still lying in her pool of blood and was not going to take the oath. Therefore, she exclaimed that she refused to remain silent about everything that the companions had seen a couple of minutes ago. This puzzled the stranger and the barbarian. The marauder approached the barbarian and raised the knife high, while she quietly said goodbye to her and was already preparing to strike, but waited a couple of minutes. Bjorn calls out to Einar and asks her to put aside her barbarian pride and swear that she will remain silent, since the main thing now is to survive. For some time she is not even going to accept this and says that it is better to die than to ask for mercy from other races and people. The main character shouted to Einar and said that she promised to trust him and follow his instructions, so she must swear and save her life. The puzzled barbarian thought for a while and closed her eyes while she swore an oath through her teeth to keep the marauder's secret. While Einar was recovering from her wounds and looking angrily at the marauder, Bjorn asked which floor the stranger had already reached in order to understand her strength. The girl turned around and left, saying that she had already reached the 8th floor, which was a noticeable difference in strength between the newcomers and her. They silently looked after the marauder while the main character thought about her words and decided that the next time they met, everything would be different. Considering that they didn't want to cross paths with the marauder again and the battle with the demons was difficult, the barbarians jumped into the portal and returned to the 1st floor. This time the hero was able to successfully land on the ground, when Einar fell face down on the stone floor and whispered that the landing was painful. The girl's mood was spoiled due to the fact that she had sworn on her military honor and was now not a warrior, so she couldn't even complain. Bjorn tried to calm his friend down and said that real warriors must avoid death at all costs, and in the future, they will be able to win back. Einar came to her senses a little and replied that she would try to stop hating herself and try not to kill herself while they waited for the moment of revenge. The guy didn't answer anything while he tried to understand his girlfriend's feelings, since he is still not a real barbarian, and their problems are not known to him. On the 1st floor, they found a good place to stay for the night, and Einar went to bed first, while Bjorn began to think that he too was not feeling well. He may not have taken the situation to heart, but the player still felt some kind of emptiness inside him because of how they took pity on him again. He realized that he was still a beginner, and could not believe that he would not need help because he was still weak and should be glad that he was alive. The feeling of shame after being pitied for the 2nd time became the impetus for him to come up with a better way to level up. So the barbarian woke Einar and asked her opinion on a more effective but riskier plan to improve combat performance. Einar was only for such a plan and replied that it was better than nothing, because in any case they could die, but this way they could train. Therefore, Bjorn stood up and declared that they were going to look for the rift to practice fighting various monsters there. While the main characters were walking, they were able to defeat 3 new creatures of the 9th rank, from which crystals also fell. Soon their journey was over, and they came to another room where there was a memorial to the magician who was the first to find the labyrinth and became the first adventurer. Bjorn noted that the same description of the memorial was present in the game. That is, the hidden mechanics associated with the memorial also did not change. Before starting the ritual, the main character again asked Einar to remain silent about how they got here, what would happen now, and she agreed. The rift is a labyrinth within a labyrinth and can be passed through with the help of a specific command. Bjorn decided to place crystals of 4 different monsters and 1 crystal of the death demon on the memorial to open a passage to the rift. A huge and ominous portal opened in front of them, and the 2 quickly ran into it, since there was little time from the very beginning. These portals are willful and can appear on various floors of the labyrinth, both before everyone's eyes and somewhere in complete darkness. They have a restart cycle during which none of the portals appear, so the researchers found a way to bypass the cycle and summon a portal. The main characters appeared inside the rift, which turned out to be an eerie place, similar to a destroyed world, and was called a bloody citadel. Einar was here for the first time, so her fear was obvious, and Bjorn noticed the terrible atmosphere and noticed that goosebumps were running on her skin. A new portal opened behind them, which meant the arrival of their new and at the same time completely random ally for a while in the rift. At this moment on the first floor, Tertia teaches Erwin that she should be able to defend herself without a bow and without fortitude, but only with 2 knives. Erwin admits that she is much more comfortable using the power of spirit and arrows, to which Tertia tries to explain to her sister the importance of conserving strength. The younger fairy sighs and remembers Bjorn and says that according to him, you need to focus on what you do best and trust your companion. The older sister was not satisfied with this answer, and she took the younger sister by the shoulders, saying that companions are not very important and you need to be able to defend yourself. To change the topic, Erwin suggests that his ally go to the 2nd floor, since there could be a much larger catch there. Tertia replies that they have nowhere to rush, and it will be great if they walk along the 1st floor and find a portal to the rift. The sisters agreed and went on a search, saying at the same time that not everyone manages to find the portal, and usually restarting the passage lasts 8 months. Tertia reassures Erwin and says that if she follows her older sister, within a year she will be able to become a professional adventurer. At that moment, a portal to the rift appeared in front of them, which interrupted their sisterly conversation. There was no time to waste, and Tertia ordered her younger sister to run as fast as she could to the portal, which they did. Unfortunately, the portal closed too quickly, and the sisters did not have time to enter the rift, so they remained on the 1st floor of the labyrinth. Meanwhile, in the rift, Bjorn and Einar began to meet new allies, one of whom was a representative of the dwarven race. Immediately behind him came the rest of the temporary team, who turned out to be a magician and a guy who simply wore things that were not hers. The dwarf was surprised that the magician came here, since he believed that they had not been at the 1st level for a long time, but the girl smiled in response. Einar remembers and tells Bjorn that while she was in the library, she noticed another mage who was always sleeping at the table. The main character understood and explained that magicians like the librarian are a valuable resource for the city, and only the strong go to the labyrinth. He also said that since the girl is here, it means she is strong, which the magician took as a boast and smiled at his intelligence and called herself Raven. The guy who stood behind her bowed when she called his name Zatterden and explained that he was just a guy who carried her personal things. The dwarf decided to continue the acquaintance and called himself Hikuro Murad, extending his hand for a handshake and talking about the fact that he had been exploring the labyrinth for the 3rd year. While Bjorn said his name and shook hands with his new ally, Einar was happy to meet and said her name with some enthusiasm in the hope of making friends. Bjorn decided to ask why such an experienced magician and dwarf are on the 1st floor, to which they do not answer. They only talk about their reasons. Once everyone got acquainted, Raven decided that it was time to become the head of the team and lead them, with which the dwarf could not but agree, since the mage knows better. Bjorn decided that it would be better to agree, since it was the magicians who supported the government in exterminating evil spirits, and it was not worth standing out again. But Einar was against it, and she immediately nominated her friend for the role of guide, which greatly alarmed the guy. The magician and the dwarf were upset and tried to calm the girl down by saying that everything had already been decided. But the barbarian did not stop and continued to shout that Bjorn was better. While Einar was counting all the advantages of Bjorn, the magician and the dwarf were somewhat frightened by her determination regarding this issue. Bjorn himself simply rubbed his face with his hand and remained silent, watching as his plans to remain unnoticed began to crumble because of his girlfriend. Hikuro turned out to be good at translating the topic, and said that he is now jealous of the main character, since it is difficult to find a wife who will praise you all the time. Einar desperately tried to prove to the short man that she was not his wife, while he continued to add fuel to the fire, but they were interrupted by the magician. Without further ado, Raven led them along and said that it was time for them to go to the castle to pass the rift. The dwarf was surprised at such speed and asked if they first needed to know each other's abilities, so that they could come up with plans in battles. Raven replied that she and her carrier were strong enough that they didn't have to worry about anything, because she would sort everything out. The dwarf did not like this outcome, since it did not inspire confidence at all. Raven decided to say at the very beginning of the journey about her desire to take what would fall out of the Guardian for herself, since she needed this thing for research. Here the dwarf did not remain silent and asked who she takes him for, since she wants to take all the things that they find together. The girl was not prepared for this and froze silently, trying to find a way to solve the problem in her favor. Bjorn thinks that such situations are very common in the Rift, because for magicians, research comes first, and for dwarves, money. The girl tried to start a conflict by saying that she was giving him all the crystals from the monsters, since she did not need them. The dwarf is not sure that the deal is fair, to which the magician adds that there is a huge chance of not getting anything from the Guardian, so everything is fair. In the end, they came to some agreement and forgot that they had 2 more barbarians on their team who also wanted to get something. Therefore, Bjorn took a step forward and looked them both in the eyes, asking them to give him the Rift Crystal and nothing more. The situation did not get any better, as he received a condemning face from both of them. And they also added that it was too much for a beginner and they didn't need him. Then Bjorn decided to claim 2 essences of ordinary monsters, because he did not want to return to the city with empty pockets. The mage and the dwarf exchanged glances with each other and agreed to his proposal, so that the dispute was resolved. Not even a minute had passed before the magician and the dwarf forgot about their grievances, and began to promise each other that everything would be so, while Bjorn stood behind him in surprise. He realizes that his position as a beginner is not doing him any good, so his desire to become stronger becomes much stronger. Just like the second floor, the rift is divided into 4 main zones, one of which is a suspension bridge. After the suspension bridge, there is a battlefield near the outer walls, which are the first line of defense of the castle. Immediately behind them is the dungeon area, where many scoundrels once served their sentences. In the last zone there is a statue of a demon, since this is a place to worship him, and is located in the very center of the rift in the ruler's room. At the very beginning, the team is greeted by a pair of gargoyle statues, which are actually rank 8 enemies. They usually sit motionless on their perches and attack only when they see the enemy, which is what they did now. Suddenly, Bjorn's legs began to turn to stone, a sign of one of the gargoyles' debuffs. Einar was about to run to Bjorn and help him get out of the trap, but Raven blocked her path with her staff. The magician used her staff and began to cast a spell to weaken the effects, pointing the staff at the main character. The entire stone was destroyed, and Bjorn could act again thanks to the power of the magician. A gargoyle that can't use its debuffs isn't a strong enemy, so the barbarian grabbed his weapon and ran at the monster. Bjorn was able to defeat the first one by attacking him with the head of his mace, while Einar hit the gargoyle on the back with her sword. The dwarf could handle it himself because he attacked in his own style, that is, from the bottom up, and cut off the gargoyle's leg. The final blow was dealt by the hammer to the gargoyle's head, as the monster could no longer use its power of petrification. All the gargoyles were killed, and all team members were happy. The man smiled and praised his allies for such a good battle, which he himself was glad about. While Bjorn was thinking about the peculiarities of the Battle of the Dwarves, Einar, who was standing behind him, noticed something. One of the stones that remained from the gargoyles began to glow strangely and then began to move. It turned out to be a spell from Raven, who had already agreed that she would collect all the crystals, and at the end they would share them, which the man was very happy about. The stone doors did not open, so the dwarf had to use the hammer again and break his way to the first zone of the rift. The dwarf noticed that this place was damn dark, to which Raven offered her help in lighting the hall. The girl read another spell and raised her hand up, creating a beam of light that could illuminate the place where they were. As soon as the light hung on the ceiling of the room, everyone noticed strange creatures called dead people, who have no rank, do not give experience in crystals. It would not be advisable to fight against them with the help of a mage's magic, so the company decided to go through with the help of physical force. As soon as the dead noticed the new arrivals, they ran towards the team in the hope of eating each of them. Bjorn, Einar, and ran straight towards them, holding their weapons ready to fight. Einar cut the first of them in half without thinking about it. The dwarf continued and hit the head of one of the dead with his hammer so hard that the head went into the neck. Bjorn was able to defeat 2 at once, kicking the first with a shield and finishing off the second with a mace, causing them to fly up and die. The battle turned out to be quite fast, and the main character noticed something left from the dead man. It turned out to be a huge horn of the ruler of the dead, which you can blow into. Einar was the first to ask what this thing was for, and the dwarf replied that she would soon find out for herself what the horn was for. The doors ahead were also closed, so the magician went to the door and offered to deal with it herself, after which she ordered the others to move away. The girl read a new spell, which called upon the force to destroy the door in a couple of seconds. When the light from the spell disappeared and the dust from the destruction began to settle on the ground, the magician was already standing in front of the destroyed doors and offered to continue on their way. Just beyond this gate was the first rift area with a raised suspension bridge, without which they would not be able to move forward. The magician turned to Einar and invited the girl to blow the horn and see what happens next, and the barbarian agreed. The girl came forward and raised the horn to her lips, and a loud sound was heard, which at first glance did not change anything. Immediately after, the bridge began to slowly descend towards them, and the suddenness frightened Einar. The barbarian also noticed that the water level also began to rise rapidly, which surprised her even more. As it turned out, the reason why this place was called a bloody citadel was the presence of dead people in the water, who began to raise their hands to the call of the horn. Raven noticed her friend's confusion, and reassured her by saying that they were just dead people and were easy to deal with. But these words did not reassure Einar. After a couple of seconds, the first hand of the dead man grabbed the ground and was ready to rise towards them and attack. The entire team was surrounded by the dead who wanted to taste fresh human flesh. Raven called for everyone to come closer to her, since the spell was ready and she could begin to attack in an area. The girl raised the staff and read a spell, waving the staff in different directions, drawing something in the air. Her forces scattered around and began to attack all the enemies in a row, knocking them down and then killing them, while none of the allies were harmed. They remained standing among the heaps of dead bodies, which for now lay and did not move. The dwarf could not help but say that he was still surprised by the magician's strength, but the magician just laughed quietly and said that it was nothing surprising, since these were dead people and nothing more. Bjorn is still trying to figure out how to behave with a girl in order to suck up to her like that. The magician straightened her hat and noted that now all they could do was wait for the bridge, which continued to descend. Finally, their wait comes to an end. The bridge touches the ground, and the heroes can cross it to the other side. They decided to continue their journey and go inside. Since the first zone of the rift was completed, as Bjorn noted, it was damn simple. They quickly crossed the bridge of the outer wall, which was the first line of defense, and headed towards the inner castle. They were still being chased by a variety of monsters, but Raven's area of effect attack was killing almost everyone as it began to weaken. Some small and large monsters remained alive, so we had to deal with them ourselves. The death demons also remained alive due to their rapid regeneration and were already approaching the adventurer team to kill them. The magician decided to leave all the other monsters in the hands of her allies, and they ran forward ready to kill the creatures like cattle. Bjorn and Einar ran to the death demons and took one by the legs, as before, after which the barbarians threw the monster over and prepared to punch him in the face. The dwarf watched silently and fearfully as the duo beat up their victim with the most joyful and evil smiles on their faces. A little later, Raven was able to prepare another spell and activated it with a wave of her staff. This power weakened the instant recovery effect of the death demons, making them an even easier target. The dwarf also did not lag behind the barbarians and continued to kill the monsters one by one. After a couple of minutes, all the stones that were left from the monsters began to move towards the girl's backpack and put into the side pocket. While the magician was talking with her friend, Einar told Bjorn that she now knows why magicians are treated so well in Raphonia. The dwarf agrees and adds words about the talent of magicians in battles, which Raven hears out of the corner of her ear. Satisfied with the praise, the girl turns to us and replies that magicians always study and practice diligently, but she also has talent. Also for research, Raven asked for help in collecting some materials that might become interesting to her later. The team decided to move on, and Einar went with them and began to count how many pies she could buy while Bjorn stood behind. He wondered if the magician knew about some secret places here, and if he knew, then why didn't he go and get the treasure? And he was talking about a statue that in the game gave you a reward if you interacted with it. Each player, if you find a strange-looking thing, you need to interact with it and you will get something from it. Bjorn would be happy to go up to the statue and receive the reward, but he could hurt the magician's feelings, because he is a newbie and knows more than she does. The main character abandoned this idea and followed the company of adventurers who continued their journey to the center of the rift. They continued on their way and entered the second line of defense, which was called the inner castle and was now destroyed. The dwarf said that they were unlikely to find anything here, since there were no monsters visible either, to which the mage agreed and suggested moving on. Bjorn brought it in search of a secret passage to the dungeon, while the dwarf and the worried Raven waited for an answer from him. The team was able to find a secret passage, and the barbarians began to go down into the dungeon first. The rest followed behind. They found themselves on the first level of a dungeon called a dungeon, the gloomy atmosphere of which alerted Einar. Making his way deeper, Hikuro approached the magician and asked what monsters might be present on this floor, to which the girl told about several types. One of the monsters mentioned was a corpse golem, which the dwarf had never fought before, as this species is only found in the rift. Raven smiled and replied that it would be a wonderful new experience, especially when everything went smoothly, thanks to the magician's power. Bjorn still couldn't wrap his head around how just a minute ago the magician and the dwarf were fighting for the things they would receive, and now they walked together as friends. Einar remained on the side of the protagonist and asked, pointing to the skeleton of a rat, what kind of creature this was, and the barbarian would be happy to answer. But the magician interrupted him, reminding him that this was a skeleton rat, which she had already spoken about. But Einar's answer did not go well, and she asked Raven to remain silent. The girl was offended and puffed out her cheeks because she wanted to stand out again, but it didn't work. A minute later, the barbarian heard the heartbreaking scream of the monster they had heard on the second floor. Yielding to fear, she ran up to Bjorn and hugged his hand, noticing in tears that this creature might be somewhere nearby. Raven was only happy with this outcome and continued to scare Einar with her inventions, which only made the girl fuss more. The girl joyfully walked forward, leaving Einar to shake in fear, until Bjorn says that the magicians have a spell against them too. Raven is surprised by the barbarian's wisdom, agrees with the barbarian, and takes a step forward to deal with the monsters. The mage raised her staff and directed her power at one of the Ranshu, whose voice Einar was so afraid of. Then, out of nowhere, 5 of the same monsters attacked Raven, and they were about to touch her and pass on the curse. But another spell quickly pacified them, and the monsters began to blaze. Manga turned to the team and extended her hand, saying that they could continue on their way to the Guardian's Hall and no obstacles would stop them. Raven's smile did not save the situation, but only further frightened the guys who silently watched as she killed with one swing of her staff. During the passage, the team of adventurers met gnomes and a dashing beast, which are enemies of the 9th and 8th ranks. Later, they were able to meet the Lord of the Dead himself, who was still at rank 8 and was easily defeated. The allies entered one of the rooms, which is very reminiscent of a typical movie laboratory due to strange tools and corpses. The dwarf didn't like the sight, but he noticed that Raven was still in this place, so he asked how she held on like that. She replied that she had dissected people many times before and was used to worse than this room, while simultaneously feeling the wall. As a result, they found a secret door and stood in front of it, thinking about what could be behind these bricks other than a corpse golem. Raven recommended leaving all her belongings behind the door, so her porter, dwarf, and barbarian placed their backpacks near the wall. Also, the girl immediately warned that they would need light, so Bjorn raised his hand to his magic torch and lit it. When the door opened, a huge dark room appeared in front of them with whole mountains of human corpses in it. They decided to move forward while Bjorn thought that if he had been his true self, he would have long ago been unable to contain his horror and vomit. The first to surrender was the porter, who bent over and leaned his hand on his sword, trying to hold back the impulse with his hand. Raven had exactly the same consequences, who also soon bent over and tried to stop vomiting, but the smell of corpses was there. Hikuro, Bjorn, and Einar were the only ones who were fine, so they continued on their way forward to inspect the room. Right in front of them was a huge corpse mountain from which sounds that were incomprehensible at first glance came out. A little later, the muffled sound turned into a human voice that said hello and scared the hell out of the barbarians and the dwarf. As soon as the voices began to scream, begging for help and death, some began to melt and one red eye opened between them. This was the corpse golem that Raven had spoken about earlier, and Bjorn realized that there was no time to waste, so he decided to act. The main character turned around and looked at the dwarf, about to discuss their plan to destroy the corpse drum. But Hikuro was frozen and silently clutched his hammer with fear in his eyes, looking forward, so there was no need to expect help from him. The voices of the bodies from which the golem was created began to merge into one large chorus, which began to wish for the death of Bjorn's allies. The fairy who dissected people many times, and the dwarf who explored the labyrinth for 3 years, quickly turned out to be useless. The main character was not at all happy about this outcome, since now he had to deal with the monster himself. Only he and Einar are left, who will have to hold back the enemy and at the same time protect the others. The main character tells us that one of the interesting aspects of the game was the very realistic pictures. But once again, Bjorn is faced with the fact that reality always looks more alive, which is why he gets scared, because the golem didn't even talk in the game. Einar was no better in this situation because she too was seriously tense, listening to the screams of the actual dead. Suddenly the golem spat out one of the bodies, which flew towards Einar, and she turned around, ordering the others to move away. Bjorn followed the advice and jumped away while Hikuro was unable to move a finger due to a feeling of fear, which the girl quickly noticed. The lightning barbarian reacted and cut the body above her head in half, preventing it from flying further than her. But the caustic blood of the corpse got into the dwarf's eyes and caused irritation, which only made the situation worse. Bjorn ordered Einar to take Hikuro's arm and run into the Manga to protect them from possible attacks. Without hesitation, the girl agreed and pulled the dwarf along with her towards the magician and her porter, while the barbarian ran towards the corpse golem. Burning with hunger for living flesh, the monster and the human corpses in its body extended their arms towards Bjorn in an attempt to capture and eat the barbarian. But the main character was no slouch, so he successfully jumped away at the right moment, thinking about the fact that it was impossible to get close to the monster. During the monster's inactivity, Bjorn seriously thought that he also could not go too far. Otherwise, the golem would attack his allies. The only thing the barbarian could do was distract the golem's attention while saving the lives of his friends. Raven finally woke up from nausea and saw the situation they were in. So gathering all her strength into a fist, she decided to act. The girl grabbed her staff and pointed it at the golem, casting a fire spell, the power of which immediately flew into the monster. Bjorn looked silently at what was now happening to the corpse golem, while Einar ran to him to help and see the spectacle herself. They silently watched as the monster's entire body began to blaze with fire, and the voices first screamed in agony and then began to subside. This turned out to be not the end, because the half-decomposed hand of the monster nevertheless appeared from the pillar of fire and still tried to catch the barbarians. Soon the skeleton of the still-living monster itself appeared, which was the second and last phase of the corpse golem. The matter remained small, so the main character ordered Einar to run after him and aim between the ribs of the monster to destroy it. The barbarians reached the corpse golem's chest and struck the monster's core, which turned out to be its heart. The monster died and left behind an essence that Bjorn and Einar stared at. Bjorn says that such a rift is a treasure chest, since monsters that are not present in the labyrinth appear here. The main feature of rifts is the fact that here the chance of dropping essence increases dramatically compared to the labyrinth. Einar asked her friend what they were going to do with the essence, to which Bjorn replied that it would be fair to keep it for themselves, since they defeated the monster. At first, Bjorn wanted to get 2 essences from the Death Demon and the Dashing Beast in order to increase his performance in the right direction. But the encounter with the corpse monster was the first in which they were able to obtain the essence, which made Bjorn consider absorbing it. In fact, the solution was not bad, since the essence strengthens the bones and gives the adventurer resistance to poisons and physical damage. But the problem was the skills, one of which caused enormous damage by exploding one of the body parts, which took away part of the health. The second problem was a skill that made the wearer's blood poisonous, which is why any wound could lead to the destruction of the armor. The main character sighed heavily and told Einar not to touch the essence for a while, so they decided to turn around and go to the allies.